Don's entourage, consisting of the limousine and my pickup truck. It's the limousine, and this is the pickup truck. Pretty good, huh? Good music.
We're here! We're here! Thank you. I didn't get a picture with mine. My veil is completely off my head.
You wouldn't know offhand.
Let me get your table. Okay, I'll come around here.
Everybody quiet down. I have the honor to, I guess, the first toast to the married couple, Mr. and Mrs. Don Fernbck. Everybody raise their glasses. And what I'm supposed to do now, I'm not sure.
Congratulations.
Well, congratulations, everybody. Big hand, please. Do something. Everybody gather around. They're going to cut the cake and throw things. Come back, gather around. The cake cutting is coming up. So everybody, please come into the around the cake. Will that
If I may, I'd like to propose a toast with a little preamble.
Oh, God. Scary.
First of all, I'd certainly like to thank all of you, as did Dr. Fernbach last night, for your attendance. We really appreciated that, and it's meant so much to all of our families. And we appreciate the fact that the Fernbachs are such marvelous people and that they have such creative children, what evidence of which you have just seen with this slideshow that Judy and Chris have put on. And I'd like you to join me in expressing appreciation for that. Judy? Don Fernbach last night mentioned something about mergers of the two families. He didn't mention the second component of that, and that is the acquisition part of the family. So we are toasting tonight to both mergers and acquisitions, to Don and Karen. Yeah, thank you.
Sorry. My buttons are pushing. One more, please. Is it on?
There might be a button.
You can't get that close, Court. Come here.
Okay, one more toast, please. I just want to say that about 5 years ago, when we moved back into this area, we had tickets to a Redskin Miami game, and we took Karen and Don with us. And there were some other people too, but we watched the game, and the only thing is that Don and Karen didn't watch any of the game at all. So we knew then that it must be true love 5 years ago. So I just want to give them a toast to Don and Karen and wish them all every happiness. You don't remember it, that's it.
You're not supposed to remember the game.
Thank you.
What was the score?
I have no idea. Any idea?
It's too late,
I
Dad.
don't think I need to. No, this is their daddy's.
Let me get out the picture.
Looking up here for one? There we go. All right. Cut away.
Enjoy your music.
Oh, big piece. That's a big piece.
Pull it out, put it on the plate.
Oh, yes.
Oh, 6 years. You hear this? 6 years he's waited for this.
I need to cut a piece off.
Finally got married? I don't think I'm clear on what the subject is. Finally got married. I knew it was going to happen all along. It was a given.
When did you first know it was going to happen?
I'm really happy for Don.
Yeah, very happy.
That he finally got married.
He's a lamb.
Finally. We're going to show these.
Yeah. And we all gave him these.
He got a prize.
Don't leave home without it.
Okay. Judy, let's go dance.
I'm sure.
It wasn't me.
What?
I would never have
it
done
wasn't
that.
me. It never.
Trust me.
Did what?
Look at the camera in the eyes. Look at Bill. Look at Bill.
What's that do? I don't know what I want. I am O.J. Simpson. The glove doesn't fit.
Where have you been for the last 2 hours?
The glove doesn't fit. I've been here.
Been here all
What took
along.
you so long to get here?
We got lost.
No, I don't believe it.
Yeah.
We got lost.
The glove doesn't fit.
They practiced and practiced. He's so guilty.
Where's Robert Shapiro?
It wasn't me.
After a while, any last words?
Any last words? Elope.
What? You have a word?
Yeah.
Oh. Fine, you're okay.
No.
Go.
I'd like you to know that these are two of the finest young gentlemen I've ever met in my life. And that's the truth.
Okay, you're on.
They had the honeymoon suite at the Fair Lakes High.
And we're there.
And what happened there tonight?
You're in big trouble, buddy. That's the phone number. He wouldn't tell me what room. He just said they had the honeymoon
they got to let us in.
They're having a bottle of champagne delivered to their room at 11:30.
Did they mention something about us being there before?
He said, yeah, a bunch of people came in looking for a room, but they didn't realize, they thought they had already registered. That's why they were pulling up the people who had already registered.
John, is there anything else you'd like to say?
They're having a bottle of champagne delivered at 11:30 to the room.
Could we deliver?
It's being delivered.
Thank you.
So if you get there at 11:30 with the guy delivering the champagne.
You're on.
It's been a wonderful wedding. I have nothing actually to say. What are these people doing over here that might disrupt this wonderful festive?
So, Rick, how long did it take you to prepare that toast? Can you scoot back just a little bit? Your nose is slightly enlarged. Thank you.
Which toast, Karen?
The toast tonight. How many days preparation does that take?
Tonight?
Yeah.
Just a few minutes ago?
Yeah.
That was like a 10-second toast.
And the one last night?
I thought I was through last night. I didn't know I'd had to do another toast. So that was cruel and unusual, and I'll charge your brother extra for that. I'm getting paid.
Excuse me, sir. Can you stay right in the middle of the camera?
No. I'm sorry.
Okay, Peter, do you have any parting shots? I mean words for Don and Karen.
Have a wonderful time. Enjoy yourself wherever you go. Thank you for the cake. I enjoyed myself.
What kind of cake
Try not
is
to
it?
trash out the house. It's a black and white cake.
Do you have any advice for them?
Advice. Stay in Washington.
Okay.
Don't ever move back to Texas.
Yeah, and you want to elaborate on that?
I've already told them.
Okay.
You know, I'll stick with them.
All right. Anything else? How many children do you think they should have?
As many as they can.
Okay, thank you. Hello? Go ahead, introduce yourself.
Hi, Donald. You probably know who I am. I'm Eric. One of the Erics in the Landry clan. Man, a few words, but if I did have some advice for you, I think it would have to be get out of the construction industry as quickly as you possibly can. And if you have children, encourage them to not be architects or contractors.
Why is that?
It's not a profession fit for man nor beast.
Okay.
You can ask Peter. I'll probably tell you the same thing.
Peter? Back to you. Do you pass on that same recommendation?
No. I think Don is totally cut out to be a contractor. He should never change his profession. It's probably the only thing he can do. Besides hunting and fishing, is contracting.
Okay, thank you, Peter.
Quit making that face, Karen. Karen, stop it.
Hey, Peter.
Okay, Eric, you're on. Can you give us a single man's perspective on the whole thing, please?
I think it's a good thing. It's a good thing.
Can you be more specific?
It's good to be married. It's great to be alive. It's good to be in America.
Are they mutually exclusive, though?
Not necessarily.
Oh.
It's great to be single alive in America. It's probably good to be married as well.
Okay,
That's all I have to say.
thank you.
Talk to him now.
Peter.
Peter.
Wait a minute, not on.
The bees.
Hi, Bob.
Hey.
Give us some ideas, or how about some advice for Don and Karen? Anything you'd like to recommend?
Let's see.
Don't leave home without it.
Just be happy and prosperous. Good times and bad times. Good times outweigh the bad times.
Okay, is that pretty much, does that cover it?
No, and Don, you're not a better fisherman. Me and Robert disagree with you. And, are you on yet?
Yeah.
Oh, you are on? We know where your room's at, and you owe me $5. Hey! Well, we don't know what he's talking about.
Okay, Carol's going to tell us a story about Don and Karen, or just Don?
Both.
Both.
Don and Karen.
Okay, go ahead.
And you must be Don's brother, Karen, right? That's who's interviewing you. Well, there was this time we were in Colorado. It was Karen's first fishing trip. Oh, that finger. Okay, I see it. All right, I got it. All right. And Karen caught a huge rainbow trout. It was huge. And it was her first cast, and it was her first fishing trip ever. And she put it on a string. Well, first she goes, Don, Don! She started calling for Don, and Don came over and he took it off the hook. And he put it on a stringer, and he picked up the stringer or something, and he lost it in the river. And what river was it? Where were we?
Headwaters of the Rio Grande.
Headwaters of the Rio Grande River in Colorado. So the first was a huge fish. And she caught it and he let it drift. And he didn't mean to, but he ran chasing after it.
Swam away.
And it swam away all by itself. But he had it on a stringer, so this poor fish is still to this day calling Karen's name. Karen, come get me.
With a stringer hanging out?
With a stringer hanging out.
That's rough. Well, that's a good story.
If they just avoid those kind of things, their marriage will last a very long time.
Okay, so do you recommend that they don't fish together?
No, I recommend they do fish together and Karen keeps her own stringer.
Keep your own stringer, Karen.
That sounds
There
very
you have
sage.
it.
I don't know that I can come up with something quite that good for married life that'll have a moral to it. I just have vignettes, just snapshots of Don's life
That'll
that
be
might
fine.
be helpful to Karen. But,
Just give us a little piece.
well, I guess I was just thinking of some of the issues of...
Here, Carl, I'll take it.
Yeah, we'll take your jacket, Carl. He's dancing a lot. Anyway, I guess just, I don't know, Dawn in the morning, you know, that hair, and today was the perfect day for that.
It was perfect.
It was just, the hair sticks straight up. But the thing that was different about today is that he was really cheerful. And Dawn in the morning is usually a really rough sight. So...
That's a good point.
It is.
He was cheerful this morning.
But I guess, you know, I've been telling Andre stories about our childhood, and I think I told Don the story about he and Robert got into this big mud fight. I told this story to Andre, and of course Andre a week later had to have a big mud fight with Camille. But that was a very lasting impression early on in my life. And then when Uncle Ralph shaved both of their heads and they came to greet me at the bus stop, they didn't have a speck of hair, and it was just this shiny bald head. It was like the crew cut just slightly half an inch too short. Oh, it was hilarious. These were shiny-headed boys.
I
They didn't
remember
have
that.
even a
They were
speck of hair
so
on.
cute.
They were just adorable. And I loved carrying Don around. I was 7 when he was born, and I just, became a second mother. He was right. I told him what to do, and,
Well, you're going to have to cut it short now. My back's about to give out.
Okay, all right. That's it. Okay.
Yeah, I'm getting old.
Happy marriage. Congratulations. We love you.
Francis, do you have any advice that you'd like to pass along to Karen?
Of course I do. Let's see, Karen and Don, I think I already told you this once, but I want to tell you again, only because it works so well for Clint and I, that you should always fight naked. Always, always fight naked.
Now, is this fist fighting or verbal sparring or?
This is verbal sparring.
Okay.
Disagreements, things that you are not happy about, discuss them naked.
And what are the advantages to fighting naked?
Oh, it's much briefer.
The whole discussion.
Oh, yes. Much shorter duration and usually has a good outcome.
And how long would you say your average fight is?
Oh gosh, our fights?
Average naked fights. 10 minutes?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Have a great life, Karen and Don. I know you will. I don't need to say it. Love you.
Does the light go on? There's a...
You're on, and I'd like to ask you all what advice that you have for Don and Karen, because you have some experience in marriage.
In the Anderson family.
We certainly
And
do
in the
have
Anderson
experience in
family.
marriage.
The Anderson
10 years and 20, yes, in the Anderson family, and I would say continue to communicate the way they seem to do very well. Christy mentioned that Redskin game we went to, and they didn't see one play. They just kept talking and talking.
What were they doing?
By the way, we hate Dallas.
We hate Dallas.
We don't mind
Go
Houston.
Skins.
Go Skins. I would say that one of the great things is the Anderson family is so close, and I know that Karen will continue to keep that closeness, and Don fits right in, and he's smooth as silk. So I think it's a great couple.
Well, I just think Don's done a lot of persevering. You know, the Anderson family Christmases and where we have big Christmases, loud Christmases, and Don's done a really good job. Don and Bob both. So.
Well, something on a serious note really is that Don clearly misses his family in Texas, and it's been clear
In Seattle.
Oh, thanks.
Seattle, sleepless in Seattle, and that he struggled a lot with staying in this area. And he's persevered, and I guess he found a jewel that he couldn't put aside. So we're really happy to be part of their marriage, and hope they continue to be close to us.
Great.
Good luck to Don and Karen.
Good luck.
Thank you.
Go Skins.
Automatically goes off. Quick, you're on.
Okay, hey Karen, congratulations, you and Don. Say some advice to the bride and groom. King size bed, separate checking accounts. What else is? Don, you have to be a cook. Have to clean it.
I don't think he cooks.
She never has been able to cook.
She can't cook, they're gonna go hungry.
I've been trying to help her, you know, on the phone. I'll continue to try. We'll send her a quick, easy recipe and she can cook some stuff up for her.
Are you two good
King,
cooks?
McDonald's. Oh, God, yes. What's up? We're good cooks, aren't we? Oh, we're running the Beyonce restaurant. Wonderful cooks.
There's John over here. Do you want to be in this filming or just on the edge?
You're on it now. He's on it.
All right.
That was a good sport. Karen made a pot roast meal one night. And she put, I think, a whole bottle of kitchen bouquet in. And the gravy was black. But Don never said a word. He was a good sport. He ate the whole thing. I declined on the dinner. I didn't eat it, but Don ate it.
Did he get sick?
Good guy.
No, but they did get sick when she fixed something one time. They were both sick a couple days.
Really?
Yeah, I don't know.
It seems like every time I call, they're sick and vomiting.
They were, she fixed, I don't know what she fixed. About 30 minutes. They were sick for a couple of days.
I think back in Georgia she knew how to fix us macaroni and cheese.
Macaroni and cheese.
Yeah, macaroni and cheese. It's a good time.
She can make good cakes and good cookies.
Yeah, we were all good at that. Yeah. We learned that in Girl Scouts together, remember? Of course, I did win the blue ribbon.
But they won't go hungry.
Any other advice?
I don't even think of this.
Any stories? Any
told all of them.
Any parting thoughts?
We love you both to death.
Okay. Go ahead. Oh. Is there anything else you want to say?
How was the cake?
How many pieces did you eat? One. How about you, Camille? Did you get any?
Are you guys on the West Coast or the East Coast?
10. All right, wave goodbye. Wave goodbye. Goodbye.
East Coast.
Okay, you all have over 40 years of experience, so what do you all have to offer?
So long, Dorothy. I want you
Couldn't hear the question.
The question is, with your 40 years of marital experience, what do you have to offer to the bride and groom? What kind of advice?
I think anything I say would be held against me.
And I think he's correct.
Anything else?
Well, do you think you could possibly say something nice to Don and Karen?
Something nice?
Or does that hurt too much?
Oh, here we go.
All right.
We're going to get to throw some bird seed.
Okay, you have about 3 seconds.
Mom, can I use the last picture?
It's a nice day today.
Hey, Judy and Chris, now that you have 6 months of experience, Mom and Dad had...
That's 5.
Oh, 5 months. They have 40 years and had nothing to say. With your 5 months, do you all have anything that you would like to say to Don and Karen?
Well, there's some really important things about getting along after you've been on your own for a while.
What are all these cameras?
First of all, pick up your socks.
And close the damn dresser drawers, okay? It really bugs me when they get left open.
And try to close them within 30 seconds after you open.
And look at me when I'm talking to you.
Otherwise, your wife will close them for you.
The other thing is, Dawn, when she's talking to you, don't watch the basketball game, okay? It's really important to communicate.
Unless it's the Rockets.
Eye contact, very important.
Yes. And Dawn, when you're reading the newspaper, still pretend like you're listening to her, okay? Just go, every now and then. Okay?
Remember the eye
Talent
contact.
that you have to work on.
Yeah. And then don't just go, what did you just say? Just pretend like you heard everything.
And just guess at an answer and hope it's right.
So if you get all those things done, y'all should have smooth sailing. It's really no problem. Oh, Karen, make Don cook sometimes, and if he doesn't want to cook, he has to take you out to dinner, okay? Because you know it is a 50-50 deal, all right?
I agree,
Practice this one
absolutely.
saying, yes, dear, whatever you'd like. Yes, dear.
Very good.
I always heard you're supposed to give 110%.
Of what? Your income? I'll take it.
Yourself. Or was that a bank motto? It pays 110% interest?
Yeah, well,
That was a football player.
Judy expects that out of
There's Eric. He'd like another interview, especially since the lighting is now adjusted on the camera. Are you ready?
Through this. Yo no hablo inglés, por favor. Habla something else.
Say it in Finnish.
Say it in Finnish.
And then you'll be finished.
I'm done.
Okay, Joyce and Jack, you're on.
All right, our wish for Don and Karen, from an instructional point of view, is that Don and Karen both need to learn how to play cards a little bit.
Oh my, yes.
Most specifically, how to shoot the moon and remain poker-faced throughout the process. Once they do that, then we will be able to communicate far, far.
And we want them to know all about their boat. We're so happy to have Don with us, part of our family, and we just wish them all the best.
Okay, thank you.
I asked her if she wanted
Here we are, getting down to the very end. Some people are throwing prematurely. They can't seem to wait any longer. It's a little hard to wait. Let's go! Let's go! It's getting ugly now.
Come on, Don! Where are you watching? We want the garter.
Let's go!
Oh, come on.
Okay.
Hey, Don, it's been 6 years.
Yeah, let's go. Let's go.
Here's some.
You're not going to run, are you?
Here's some, baby.
No, you're not.
Run the fire.
No.
Okay, it's a new day. It's the next day after the reception and the wedding. We're feeling a lot better, and we have some fresh words for Don and Karen. You're on.
You're on.
Go ahead, Mom. What do you want to say?
I'm speechless. To Karen and Don, I want them to have the greatest life together that any couple could have. I really think they're meant for each other, and we love them.
Okay, great.
That was very good. We think that, I don't think, we would like to see them have a long, happy married life like we have, both our mother and dad and ours, with a good bunch of kids to liven it up all along the way. And we hope they'll find all those rewards as they go along, maintain their mutual respect, and continue to enjoy the good things regardless of what's happening around them.
Okay, great, thanks.
Okay.
Hi, Don and Karen. I finally get to talk now. Actually, I was talking all throughout the film. Not going to hear me, but I wanted to give you my best wishes, or our best wishes from Gene and President Carl and me. And we hope that you all are really happy, and you come and visit us, and that you have children, and you have a lot of fun. And that's it.
Is that it?
That's it.
Is that all you have to say?
That's it. Keep it simple.
Okay. Bye. Bye.
Turn it off, Peter.
It's raining, but nobody knows it. Oh, the Fernbach clan, yeah.
That's right.
With our new member.
Hey.
Newest member.
Hey.
She gets the last number.
We haven't caught up
She
yet.
gets the last number on the family reunion t-shirt.
Should be drawing numbers today.
Okay, is that enough?
No.
We're done. Yay! We're all walking away.
Let's get the video.
Well, this was
Going. See if we get any interference.
Okay, my name is Pete Schwank, and I've got my cousin Donald Fernbck here today, and he's going to share some experiences of World War II. Don is my second cousin. We share the same great-grandmother. So Don, why don't you start off and give us your full name, date of birth, and so forth.
Okay. Donald Joseph. Joseph after the German grandfather. Actually, Alsatian grandfather. Donald Joseph Fernbach. I was born in Brooklyn in Bushwick Hospital, which no longer exists, on the 10th of April 1925. We lived there for 1 year before we moved out to Long Island. And I grew up in Belrose, and just before World War II began, we moved to Floral Park, which was a nicer, a little higher scale, middle class suburban town with lots of flowers. It was fitting that it be named Floral Park. I went to school at the Floral Park Belrose School, so it combined both towns, and graduated from elementary school in '38, went on to high school at Sewanaka High School. Sewanaka is still there. In fact, I went to the 50th reunion just not too long ago. I was 16 years old at the time of Pearl Harbor. We were in our house on Aspen Street on Long Island. My grandmother and grandfather were there. That was Joseph Fernbach. And the family was all there in the afternoon. We had finished eating dinner as best I can recall. And I was coming down the stairs when something happened, and I wasn't sure what it was. And I heard everybody talking and kind of gasping, and everybody looked very solemn and upset. And I learned, I didn't hear the radio message, but I heard from them that the Japanese Air Force or Japanese Air had bombed Pearl Harbor. And this was a shocking thing for everybody. Nobody was prepared for this. We knew all about the war in Europe. We'd heard what the Germans were doing, and everybody was very concerned about this. And we knew Hitler was a pretty dangerous personality, and he had joined up with Mussolini, the Italian dictator, and a formidable army resulted from those, which were then coming up against the French and the English, who were not so well equipped. The French had a big army, but it wasn't a very modern type army, and it was not very well led. The British had a very small army, very small air force, and when the Germans invaded Poland, of course, the British and the French declared war on Germany, and neither one of them had anything to fight with. So the war went on for quite a while before there was any action. They called it the phony war. And in fact, the British sent airplanes to France, and they just sat around and practiced. They didn't see any German planes, and the Germans didn't attack, and nobody did anything for quite a while. And then all of a sudden things began to happen. But we were not involved with that. At least we were unaware of it as teenagers. And at 16, you're aware of what's going on. It's a kind of an attractive thing for teenage. You think of it in an adventurous sense. And we knew that there was fighting in a number of areas, and but we didn't grasp the full impact of it. So when Pearl Harbor came, it was left no doubt that the United States was going to be involved. At that time, we fought against the Japanese, and I really wasn't aware that we had a real problem with the Japanese, although they knew there were discussions with the Japanese ambassadors in Washington, and we found out later that they hadn't even delivered their
there's statements that we could expect hostilities before the Japanese Navy and Carrier Task Force attacked Pearl Harbor. And of course we knew then a number of American soldiers had been killed and sailors, and we didn't know how many, and it was very scary. And my grandmother started crying when this news came across, and I think back that she was probably crying because she could see this as a long-term thing. And having been aware of what went on in World War I and how horrible it was, she had a 16-year-old grandson, the only Fernbck grandson, and I'm sure she felt that I was old enough that I would very likely become involved as a soldier, and she was certainly very correct, although I was still very young at that point. From there, of course, in a few days, President Roosevelt declared war both on Japan and Germany. I don't know whether Germany declared war on the United States. I think they did. I think Germany declared war on the United States first, and then we immediately declared war on Germany, and then we were involved. And we were not very well prepared, as most everybody knows by this time. Our Navy was caught napping and didn't do a very good job of defending itself. The Army was not very well equipped. It wasn't very big. The Air Force was a fledgling Air Force, if anything. They had some modern aircraft, but the P-40 was probably the best fighter we had at that time, and it wasn't really the equal of most of the aircraft, such as the German Messerschmitt or the Japanese Zero, and found out later the Zero was a very effective fighter plane, and certainly the Messerschmitt was a fine airplane. And we knew that the British were developing some extremely good airplanes. So we were beginning to learn a lot, and of course all the high school kids talked about all this, and the older kids were aware that they were likely to be drafted when they were 18 and so forth. And we went on with school and read the newspapers, and all of the news for the first year of the war was really bad news. Everything was bad. The Japanese moved rapidly into the South Pacific, and we were concerned they might be landing in Hawaii and attacking Hawaii, or even the west coast of the United States. So we followed the newspapers and lived with all the apprehensions everybody had while the United States prepared to deal with taking on two major military nations involved in a war. And nobody knew what was likely to happen. And with the series of events that followed, it looked to me as if it was going to be a very long, drawn-out battle, because the Japanese were kicking the daylights out of us everywhere. They were moving into Southeast Asia. They were already in China, Manchuria. They spread on down into the Philippines very rapidly, and many of the South Sea islands, and it looked like they were just going to go right on down and take Australia. They moved into the Solomon Islands, and the Solomon Islands was the first place in 1942 where the U.S. military forces made a major defense on land, and that was in the Battle of Guadalcanal. And there, for the first time, the Japanese expansion, which up to that point, it was really unchecked. And the Marines, U.S. Marines in Guadalcanal fought a bloody, vicious battle in the jungles of Guadalcanal. It was a gory kind of battle, and they defeated the Japanese. And for the first time, we began to think maybe we were going to be able to do something effective in recovering what had happened. And of course, in the meantime, the Battle of Midway occurred, and the Japanese Navy took a terrible beating when our aircraft carriers caught them by surprise and knocked out most of their major first-line carriers, and really blunted the Japanese fleet in a way that they were horrified. The Japanese leaders were horrified. And they never really recovered from that. That was probably more of the beginning of the end than anything that happened. But on land, the Battle of Guadalcanal was most impressive. Well, in the meantime, I was going to high school. I graduated in 1942 at age 17. And so I wasn't draft age. You could volunteer at that point, but I was very young. I weighed 118 pounds, soaking wet, and I wasn't really much of a soldier to look at. I was a skinny little kid. And I didn't even see myself in that capacity because I knew I wasn't a physical giant, and I wasn't much of an athlete ever. But I had gotten a scholarship, and I went to college, and I spent a year there because I got a deferment. My 18th birthday was in April, and the draft boards generally tried to be kind to the fellows. If you were in college, they wanted you to finish out your college year. That would round it out. So you could get a deferment, and I did. Meanwhile, lots of fellows were going into service, people from my high school class, people at college, and every day somebody was leaving, even at college. Some of them had already signed up and were simply waiting to go. When I finished the year, I went back to Floral Park with the family, and one of my friends down the street and I were not sure what we wanted to do. Here we were deferred, and the war was going on, and all our friends were going into the service, and we were waiting to be drafted. And they had at that time said you could not enlist in the military if you were already 18 years of age. You could 17 with your parents' consent. And so we were stuck at 18 waiting for the draft board. And it's a very annoying thing to be a young guy when everybody's going off in the military, and here you are sitting and waiting, and you don't know when you're going to be called. But they passed a ruling that you could volunteer for immediate induction, which of course no parents liked, but most of us did, because we would at least have some control over what we were going to be doing and what was happening. So Jim Farrell, my neighbor down the block, was a very nice guy and always kind to me, and growing up in that neighborhood, Jim and I decided we would go down and register for early induction. So we went down, and what that means is that you got called up virtually immediately. So in a very short time we got our notice to appear at the Mineola Courthouse, and you bring a little bag with you for your clothes and so forth, and your parents bring you over there, which is what my mother and father did, and they had a bus there, and they took us, checked our names off the list of the ones who were called up that day. And the fellow I was supposed to go in with was another classmate of mine from grammar school and high school by the name of Charlie Moncrief. Charlie was an only child, very nice guy. He was president of our senior class in high school, and Charlie was supposed to be inducted with me. Jim Farrell was not going the same time. So I was going to go out to Camp Upton on Long Island, which was the induction center with Charlie, and unfortunately Charlie got sick at home, so he wasn't able to come that day. And he came into service later, and I found out within a short period of time after I was in service that Charlie went into an infantry outfit, went through basic training into an infantry outfit, and went overseas as a replacement in the 7th Army in southern France, and was killed in southern France before I ever arrived over there. So that was somewhat of a shock when I heard that, but I heard that somewhat later. I was already in the service. So I went out to Camp Upton and got all my equipment and physical exams and everything else, and I had taken an ASTP exam record with me. Actually, it was V12, which meant if you passed the exam, they would send you through basic training, then you could go off and go to college until they wanted you to do something more in terms of the services. The V12 was the Navy program. It was a qualifying exam which I took while I was still in college. I passed it. I went down and took the Navy physical and flunked because I had an overbite. And I was eating bananas and drinking milk and everything, trying to get my weight up because I was sure they were going to flunk me on being so underweight. But that didn't seem to bother anybody. It was my overbite, which had never bothered me, that they flunked me on, and it shocked the daylights out of me. And here's an 18-year-old shedding tears because he flunked his Navy physical. And it was a blow. I was all ready to do something, and here I got shot down. So the Navy officer there told me kindly that I could take this with me and go to into the Army. When I went into the Army, I should show them the certification, and I would be eligible for the ASTP, which was the Army Specialist Training Program. ASTP, famous program. I don't know how to describe it except that it really was a reserve officers' pool. They wanted to train these people with the same kinds of courses you would have gotten if you'd gone to a military academy. In other words, a basic engineering course in college. And they had 3 semesters. If you survived to the 2nd semester, you could take a qualifying exam. If you passed it, you could be eligible to go to medical school. You would complete the full training and then go on off to graduate school and medical school. So I took that certificate and gave it to the induction officer, and he said, sure, this will count. He said, we'll get you into it, filled out all the blanks, and I filled them in, passed my Army physical with flying colors, and a couple of days later I was put on a Pullman train and ended up about 36 hours later in Fort Benning, Georgia, which is the home of the infantry school. The infantry school, also the paratroop school, and a huge military base in Columbus, Georgia. It was full of young guys my age, and we were immediately dished out into different training companies. I was in a 14th company, and they lined us up and gave us all our preliminary instructions when we would eat and when we would sleep and when we would do whatever, and gave us some preliminary commands that we needed to learn, how to stand at attention and shut our mouths when they were talking and so forth, how to salute, all the basic fundamentals to be a soldier. And that was the first day. And then we also learned how we had to keep our bunks made and clean, and they taught us how to do that right off the bat because we were going to supposed to have inspections immediately afterwards. And I then went through infantry basic training, which lasted from September. I went into service, in September 9th, 1943, which was my parents' wedding anniversary day. And I stayed at Fort Benning, completing full infantry basic until after the first of the year. And by the end of that time, remarkably, I had gained weight and muscle tone, and I went in at 118 and came out of basic training weighing about 145 pounds. And I never felt better in my life than I did at the completion of basic training. I felt like a lot of the other young guys did, that we could lick the world, that we had been brutalized in bayonet training and hand-to-hand combat. We had to run all over carrying that a 9-pound rifle with a bayonet on the end of it at port arms. Everywhere we went, holding that rifle out in front of us, and everywhere we went, we did double time, which is like a jog. And they exercised us twice a day, and we really were marched all over the place. We did all sorts of things. We learned how to shoot the rifles and the carbines and the machine guns, and I scored expert with a light machine gun, a light 30 caliber machine gun, which occurred to me immediately afterwards that, my God, if they had that on my record, they might want to make a machine gun out of me. And the machine gun, the gunner carried the rifle barrel of the machine gun, which weighed 42 pounds. So you carried that in addition to your other gear. A regular Army field pack weighed 60 pounds. If you weigh 140 pounds, 145 pounds, and you're carrying a full field pack, you've got more than half your weight on your back. And talk about breaking your back, it just about did. But we survived all that. We survived the cold and the heat and the mud and the dirt. We learned to dig foxholes and do all the fundamental things that an infantry soldier is supposed to learn how to do, and finally graduated. And once again, we're loaded on the Pullmans and shipped up to Charleston, South Carolina, which was the Citadel. I'm sure most of you heard of the Citadel. It's the military school that in 1994 was under assault by a lone female who wanted to get into it. Well, this young lady has sued to be admitted to the Citadel. We went there, and I guess it's as much a part of my World War II stories as anything I can think of, because this was a military school. It's the famous military school of the South, and the people of Charleston are very proud of the Citadel and thought it was just a wonderful place. And you bring a bunch of 18-year-old infantry soldiers into a place like the Citadel, and even if you've been to college before, you haven't been to college like this. It was run like a military school, which meant that you had to obey every rule they had vigorously. And I can sum it up and say that of the time I was there, which was about 10 weeks, I was restricted all but for one weekend because of infraction of one rule or another. I either had my thumbs hooked in my pants pockets, or I threw a piece of chalk too hard to a guy across the room who was writing on a blackboard. I did all kinds of naughty things. And we learned very quickly, as good American soldiers can do, how to accommodate. and we learned how we could escape from the prison-like barracks of the Citadel, which were concrete designed like West Point with steel mesh screens over the windows on the first floor. But with a little effort, you could pry the corners loose, and you could get out. And so we went AWOL from the Citadel every weekend. We had an opportunity to do so, and worked it with the guys who were staying behind who didn't want to go into town to sign us in, because you had to sign in every hour so they knew you were there. Anyway, to make a long story short, we disliked the Citadel intensely, and I certainly did. And I have rooted against the Citadel in every sport they ever get involved with since that time. And I'm rooting for this young woman to get admitted to the Citadel, because I thought she was taking them on in a way I never could. But we did make it unpleasant for some of the officers we had there by disobeying commands when they couldn't do anything about it. We would be in parades every Saturday, all good little cadets out there, supposed to look nice and spiffy and sharp, and we had to win the Excellence Award for marching for that Saturday. So if you have a company commander you didn't like, when you got out on the parade field, you got out of step a little bit. And if the line is not exactly straight across and isn't West Point square and geometric, it looked awful, as anybody that's ever watched a military line can attest. And all of this was staged very deliberately to get even with his company commander we intensely disliked. And he was just horrified that his company couldn't do any better. So he never won an Excellence Award, and we never got an Excellence rating, and we thoroughly enjoyed it. But finally, they announced that the program, the AST program, was being disbanded. And I had only been in the first semester and was therefore unable to take the medical school examination. And this meant that we were all being shipped out as infantry replacements. They needed infantry replacements more than they needed officers in reserve for candidate for training. And most of us were then shipped directly to Fort Bragg to the 100th Infantry Division, which was pretty well along in its training, and we were there to fill up the ranks. And they took all these wonderful ASTP boys, all these young college boys, and put them in the frontline infantry units. These are men made into riflemen, machine gunners, and so forth. When I got there, for reasons I don't know yet, I was assigned to a headquarters company in the 2nd Battalion of the 399th Infantry Regiment. The headquarters company has a series of platoons. One of them carries ammunition and does other pioneering jobs for the other outfits. They're the ones that bring the ammunition up for the soldiers in the line. Another platoon is a signal platoon that puts down telephone lines and so forth. And I was assigned to the anti-tank platoon, which consisted of 3 squads of 10 men each, and each squad had a 57mm anti-tank gun. This was a British 6-pounder, which weighed about 2,200 pounds and was hauled around by a 6-wheel Dodge weapons carrier, which meant that I didn't have to walk quite like the other soldiers in the infantry. We always had a weapons hauler when we could use it to pull our gun into position, and as far as we could get in with a weapons hauler, we didn't have to do anything. If we couldn't get in position, then we have to hook ropes over us like animals, clip it onto this gun, and haul this 1-ton gun into position wherever it might have to go. And that happened many times thereafter. So we took training on the anti-tank gun, and we really had a lot of fun with it. The guys I was with were all adventurous young fellows, and we say when you're 18, the whole thing is an adventure. And I was a pretty good shot with it. And we used to compete with the other 2 squads, and they had little targets for us. They put on 2x4 on each end, held up a bullseye, and it was on a little trolley, and they sent it out on a track out in front of us, and it could go out as far as 1,000 yards or into a couple of 100 yards, and we would fire at it. And we got so good, we would take the anti-tank gun and track the little trolley along and shoot the 2x4s one by one off the target. So they'd have to stop everything, and we'd all have to rest while they went out and reset the target. And then the next gun squad would try to do exactly the same thing, because their face would be lost if they couldn't do what the first squad did, and so forth. And all of us got very good at shooting the 2x4s off the target, which of course was no great loss. It meant you had to be doing exactly what they wanted you to do. Learn how to shoot that weapon precisely at a moving target. So that was what I stayed with all throughout the war. I was an anti-tank gunner, and I was the loader, which is the number 3 man. There's a sergeant, a staff sergeant, a buck sergeant who's an assistant squad leader, a loader. The assistant squad leader is the guy who is the gunner. He fires it. And I was the number 1 loader. And then the rest of the fellows carried ammunition and so forth. And I was equipped with a .45 caliber pistol, which was my weapon because I had to use both hands to load the gun. So anyway, after a period of months and with various training tactics and all, we finally were told we were moving out. We got on a train, and this time we went up to Camp Kilmer, New Jersey, and we were ready to debark from New York within the next few days. I got a quick pass and went home for a few hours. I lived, of course, out on Long Island. This was in New Jersey, and we were allowed to go home and not supposed to say anything about being there, of course. A loose lip could sink a ship and all that stuff in those days. But there were just ships all over the place carrying soldiers out of New York Harbor and so on. And a couple of days later when I went back, we went in and boarded the USS George Washington, which was actually a German ship that was interned in World War I by the U.S. and was converted into a troop transport, 500-foot ship, the biggest one in our convoy. We passed out of New York Harbor, and my father saw the convoy go and saw the George Washington go. And he thought that this might be us leaving because he worked for the telephone company, and his building was a tall building right downtown. Anyway, we went out, formed a convoy, joined up, and we saw the destroyers coming up and all these ships. I don't know how many ships there were in the convoy, and we headed out into the Atlantic to begin our adventure overseas. And at first it was fairly pleasant. We were allowed to go up on deck. I don't know how many thousands of soldiers were on the ship. It was just jammed full of soldiers. I was very fortunate in that we were assigned to the G hold of the ship, which is the very bottom of the ship. Decks go down A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and G was on the bottom where the 2 sides began to curve into the keel. And there were 5 high bunks there, and I was the top bunk, 5th bunk up, and you threw your gear up there in a duffel bag, and then you climbed up and squeezed yourself in there and hooked your helmet around over the side and left your whatever you wanted to reach easily in your helmet, and everybody had their helmets dangling over the side. And later that became real important in bad weather, as you can guess, which we encountered about in the mid-Atlantic. We had a ferocious storm with almost hurricane force winds, and we went up on deck to see what it looked like, and they had the decks roped off, and they came down and chased us all back down below, and we were fascinated by the size of these waves. It was an incredible sight. Well, all these ships are blacked out, so you can't see much of anything, and we had to stay down below. The worst place to be in bad sea is in a smelly, stuffy hold of a ship, and about 80% of the ship got severely seasick. We were fed twice a day in a continuous line, never stopped, and you just went up when your turn was called, and you went up and they gave you your meals, and we got a breakfast type meal usually with an orange and some other things, cereal, and then we got another meal which could be almost anything, but usually a stew or something like that, and it was enough. But it was a painful thing to have to stand in line so long. We got through the storm. Near the end of the storm, we broke a rudder cable, and the U.S. George Washington started to skew sideways. And somehow or other, they got it repaired. And I managed to get up where I could look out a porthole, and I saw a destroyer going by at the height of the storm, and the destroyer hit the oncoming wave and just vanished. The wave just broke over the entire destroyer. And then the destroyer came up and out the other side, and it was just a fascinating sight to see this ship just buried by water and then come back again. And after a few days, the storm subsided, and as I said, about 80% of the ship were seasick. And I got woozy at one point. I missed one meal, but ate everything else, and never threw up. And fortunately, I was in the 5th of the bunk, so I didn't have any of the problems that the guys in the lower bunk had, which did happen. And some of the times the head got into terrible condition because people were sick all over the place. it was pretty smelly for a while. But we got it all cleaned up. The ship had salt water for showers. If you ever take a salt water shower, you come out of it sticky as if you have Scotch tape all over you, and after a while it dries off. We had a submarine scare 3/4 of the way across, and we saw a ship burning on the horizon that apparently had been torpedoed. And all we ever saw, though, were porpoises, and watched the fluorescence at night darting around. And it was really pleasant thereafter. And we were in the southern Atlantic, as we were told, somewhere. We went in through the Straits of Gibraltar and saw the lights of Oran in North Africa, and up on deck. And it was always kind of exciting at night because it was so beautiful. The stars were so bright out in the ocean, and there were no lights anywhere, and it made everything just brighter up above. The phosphorescence of the water was brilliant without lights around, and I've never seen anything as pretty as that since. And we found out we were going into Marseille in southern France. That's where the invasion had taken place, in southern France. And we were going into Marseille, and we landed at Marseille, I guess another day out. And we got into Marseille late in the afternoon and could see the cliffs of Marseille sparkling in the afternoon sunshine. And right about the time we were due to land, a German airplane came over, and we had an air raid alarm, and 90mm anti-aircraft guns were going off ashore. We could hear them, but we didn't know what was really happening. And they just said that was Bed Check Charlie or something coming over to see what we were doing. So they knew we were there, and they knew right where we were, but nobody ever came over to attack us. To get off the ship, you had to go over the side in cargo nets, carrying all of this luggage, 60 pounds worth of stuff in a duffel bag, plus your weapons, and go down a cargo net into a landing craft, which is like a barge, which ferried you ashore. As soon as you got ashore, you were put into a marching line, and we hiked 10 miles up the cliffs of Marseille at night to a camping ground. And by that time, the beautiful weather we had when we landed had been replaced by a drizzling rain, and the road was getting slick and slippery, and we didn't know how long we were going to have to walk. So when you're walking along at night and you can barely see the people in front of you, a lot of people were tripping over each other's feet, and stones and rocks and everything else, carrying these heavy duffel bags. And I was right behind the battalion leader, major, and one of the battalion executive officers, right behind them. So all I could do was see their back end and follow them. And they didn't have to carry the weights we were carrying. And at one point we stopped for a break, and we looked back, and there were litters of duffel bags and gas mask cases. We all had gas masks then, all along the road. And soldiers had fallen out just completely exhausted from carrying this weight and not having had much exercise in the last couple of weeks coming across on a boat and all, even though they tried to give us some. And for some reason, I didn't drop anything. I kept all my gear, I kept in line, and I made it up over the cliff in one piece until we got to a muddy field, and they said, this is where you're going to pitch your tents. We were there 3 days, during which time they brought up ammunition. They brought our anti-tank guns up in big wooden crates, and we got out there with the tools we had and broke open these crates, and we assembled our own guns. We had to wash off the cosmoline and everything and get them into combat readiness and zero them in and so forth. And on the third day we packed up, and they brought down our weapons carry, we loaded our gear on it, and we started a truck convoy up to head up to the lines. And the lines were up in the area of Baccarat, France, which is in Alsace-Lorraine. And we were going into the 7th Army, which at that time they had been led by General Patton in Africa and in Italy. But Patton was relieved of command at that point and was sent to England, and later was leading the 3rd Army. And Patch became our commander in the 7th Army. And the 3rd and the 45th and 36th Divisions were going to be replaced by our division, or supplemented by our division and the 103rd Division, which came over with us. And on November 1, we arrived in the lines and began to replace the 36th Division and units of the 45th. And we went into the line immediately, and without much more fanfare, were infantry soldiers with nobody between us and the Germans. And that was the thing that, everybody kept saying, I wonder how far away the Germans are. And all the new soldiers keep asking that. And we asked the older guys, they say, right over the hill. Just don't go down that slope there or somebody will find you. And the older guys, of course, loved to tease the new guys coming up. And the first night you're in the line, everybody's very nervous, and you hear lots of gunshots by sentries who are frightened at noises they hear and so forth, and they challenge the noise, and it might be a falling tree limb or something, but they might open fire. And a lot of people usually get shot by their own guys the first few nights they're in the line. And that began our military career. And this was in the Vosges Mountains, very dense forests, very muddy, very unpleasant when it was wet, and it remained wet until we hit freezing weather in December. We were soaking wet most of the time. We dried out some briefly, but it drizzle rained, and in a forest when it rains, the trees get wet, and when it stops raining, the trees drip the water, and you have a constant stream down of water, and everything gets wet after a while, and it gets very miserable. And the next day we moved out to another position, and we're on a forward ledge, and the first incoming shell from the Germans I heard landed maybe, I don't know, maybe 30 or 40 yards from where we were. It was an 88, and it came slamming into the side of a hill just in front of us and blew dirt up in the air and all, and we flattened out on the ground, and that was our baptism of shell fire. And we were told later that we were under direct observation by the Germans from a church steeple, which was about a mile away, maybe not that far. And we were all set to knock the church steeple out with our anti-tank gun when the word came down that we were in France, and we were not allowed to destroy churches. And we knew the Germans were using it as an observation post, and we were just going to have to eat it, literally. We were not permitted to shoot at church steeples. And that remained all the time we were in France. And it was a very uncomfortable feeling to know somebody looking down your throat and you can't do anything about it. And when we had the capability of doing something about it. So there was some sporadic shell fire coming in at us during that time. And we saw recon trucks, the armored cars, six-wheel drive armored cars, recon trucks, going up the roads towards the German lines, and their job was to back in until they drew German fire and then mark the location and get back. That was how they marked the German positions. And of course sometimes they could get destroyed in the process, so it was kind of a hairy operation. And they moved pretty quickly when they had to. And we just stayed in positions until they moved us, and we moved frequently from one to the next. And were shelled many times in different places. I think that first one was as close as any shell came to us for quite a while. They landed all around us, but further away, and we didn't come under small arms fire until a little later, and that's rifle fire, machine gun fire. But the next day we moved into an area, I say the next day, I don't remember exactly when it was. I lost track of those days in there, but we were moving almost every day into a new position, digging new foxholes, and trying to make ourselves safe by cutting logs with daylight and covering the holes with logs so that they would prevent us from tree limbs falling on us, and these German shells would hit the trees and knock the branches off of them or crash into trees and explode up there, and you have a rain of shrapnel coming down, which was even worse than if it hit on the ground. And then it would explode upward, and this way it was exploding downward. And men were damaged by falling trees, and they would continue to fall even after the shelling stopped if they were broken or any wind blew up. And we went into another position where we were supposed to protect one of our line companies on a little road and put our anti-tank gun into position to protect them against tanks. And was when we were going down the road, an airplane came over and dropped something that looked like a 500-pound bomb from down below, and we couldn't make out what the airplane was. It was moderately clear at the time, although it was still misty. And this thing came screaming down right directly on us. It was a terrifying sensation if anybody's ever heard it. This thing came down and we were sure it was coming towards our position. And it didn't land very far away, maybe 60 or 70 yards away, and bounced up in the air and clattered around, and it was an empty gas tank that the pilot had dropped, released. He didn't need the gas anymore, so he dropped the wing tank. and we weren't sure whether he did it on purpose or not, but it sure was we thought it was a bomb. And we went up the road a short ways, and a whole barrage of German mortar fire came in on the position we were in. I passed one spot on the road, and I looked to my right, and there was an American soldier sitting on a log there, and I could see his eyes, and he was just looking kind of blankly, and it was apparent that he had been hit in the face, whether it was a mortar fragment or what, I don't know. And his shirt was all bloody. I couldn't make out his jaw or his mouth, and what I looked at was pretty horrible, because I saw what I thought was his tongue laying on his what used to be his chin. And that was the first wounded soldier I saw in World War II. And he was waiting to be taken to the rear. And at the time the mortar shells came in around us, we hit the ditch. And the ditch had about 8 inches of cold water. The temperature was probably in the 40s, and we all landed in that cold water while these mortar shells exploded all around us. The guy right in front of me, I could see blood coming out of the heel of his boot, and he'd been hit in the heel by a mortar fragment and was bleeding, and the boot was a shoe pack, rubberized sole like we use for Arctic boots, and it had cut through that. We couldn't see his injury, and asked him if he was in trouble, and he said, "I think I'm hit," but it said, "I just want to get the hell out of here." He said, "I can still walk and run." And a few other soldiers were wounded by that same barrage of mortar shells, and that was the end of it. And we pulled back from that position and went somewhere else behind some rather tall mountain ridge, and we were told to dig in and we could pitch tents, that we were not in the immediate edge of the line. We were behind the mountain, and our soldiers, infantry riflemen, were up on the top there, and we were down below a few hundred yards. So we pitched tents and shelter heads. And during the night we woke up to a tremendous cataclysmic sound of enormous guns going off or shells exploding. We weren't sure what. And the next morning everybody pitched tents, yeah, but they were all in their foxholes, and the foxholes had appeared during the night, and none of us slept in the tents. And the following morning we found out that we had pitched our temporary tents there in a area that was about 55 yards away from a 155 millimeter howitzer battery, which had been called on to open fire during the night. And I mean, they vibrated the ground for hundreds of yards around, all those shells going off, but it was all our outgoing artillery. It wasn't any ingoing artillery, but the noise was unreal. So we all began to feel very much like we really knew we were in the war zone, and we were beginning to learn more about it very rapidly. We were seeing wounded soldiers going back. The same day that happened, we went around a turn in a road, and I saw these green-gray soldiers laying on the ground, were bodies of a group of German soldiers. All of them were dead. And we looked at them, and I was real interested in what happened to them, and I couldn't see a mark on any of them. They were dead, but there wasn't any evidence of blood. There weren't any grotesque wounds like the one I had seen on our American soldier, but they were dead. And they had that ghastly, waxy color, all of them with their eyes open, staring, and there they were. And those were the first dead soldiers we encountered. And later on we saw American dead, and it was quoted over again that, you know, we could all look at 1,000 dead German soldiers every day, wouldn't bother us, but the first American soldier we saw, we all identified with him. He was one of our guys. And that was a quote that lasted with us throughout the war. So that was in the early part of Alsace-Lorraine, and it was just moving all along, day and night, sometimes with shell fire coming in around us, sometimes not, sometimes with shells going out, living in the mud, getting stuck in the mud, having to pull the truck out with a winch and winch out the anti-tank gun, set it up wherever we were told to put it, and dig foxholes everywhere. And the weather was getting colder all during November, and one night it snowed, and it wasn't cold enough to freeze, but there was snow on the ground. And I learned that if I could keep moving, I could keep warm. And so every chance I could in the daytime, I would chop wood and put the wood over foxholes and whatever I could. If we weren't where we were visible, I would build myself a little hole in the ground covered with logs, and I would cut the tips off the pine trees and put them in the bottom of the hole to keep out of the mud and keep myself dry as much as I could. But it was hard to keep the top of the hole waterproof. And one time, Charlie Zierman, our gunner, said he found a great foxhole that somebody else dug. Come on, share it with me. So I went up there and got in with Charlie's dry as a bone foxhole. And during the night, the rain came down a bit heavier, and I woke up sometime during the night in about 3 inches of water. That part of me was underwater and just ice cold. And there wasn't anything to do. If you turned over, the other side got wet. So you just stayed in position and shivered. And so the more pine boughs we could put in the hole, the higher up we could get, we could at least give ourselves a buffer from laying in water. And the water ran down the sides of the hole, and the dirt began to drip down through the logs on the top, and they made you pretty thoroughly miserable. And during the night you could say, you know, here I am in the middle of nowhere, thousands of miles from home, miserable, cold, and what the heck am I here for? At any rate, you got pretty miserable and times very depressed, and your gear stayed wet. And but if you moved around, and I learned very early that if you ate everything you could eat and keep your caloric intake up, you could get warm a lot faster. So at breakfast time, I just ate everything I could, and I ate what was left over. I'd eat my own share, and anything that was left over was cereal, eggs, pancakes. I just stuffed it in, and I gained weight. And a month later, when we took showers for the first time, the whole month before we got to take showers, when I stripped down, everybody came over and says, "Look at how fat Fernbach's gotten." We hadn't seen our naked bodies, so we didn't know, and I really had gotten kind of roly-poly. I was probably up close to 150, 55 pounds or so, which was all-time high for a 118-pounder. And but I was healthy as a horse. I never had a cold. And some of the guys got sick. And we were eating K rations for a while in the daytime, and a lot of people got diarrhea from the K ration. They were very bad, and a lot of us got esophagitis from eating a pork sausage that was in the K ration. The pork sausage was greasy stuff. And finally, there were so many people being taken out of the line for severe diarrhea, the orders came down that the kitchens were going to have to provide hot breakfast, hot supper, and C rations for the middle of the day. And C rations were pretty good. We all get along with C rations. They come in little cans with biscuits on the inside, on the top, and then baked beans and frankfurter and beans and scrambled eggs and ham and so forth. And they weren't bad. If you had a little paper or a little cardboard around, you could build a little fire. You could heat them, and they tasted pretty good. The only problem was that a lot of them had, for drinks, they gave you lemonade. Well, if you've ever drunk hot lemonade, it's not too exciting. But you got hot chocolate in one K ration. You got coffee in another, dehydrated coffee, and lemonade in a new one. And the K rations had eggs and ham for breakfast, and cheese, a solid hunk of cheese for lunch, and little biscuits. And the night meal was a delight because they gave you a big chocolate bar, and I ate chocolate until I couldn't eat any more chocolate. And I gathered up everybody else's chocolate. Nobody wanted the chocolate, got that and ate that too. So I was really an eating fool. But I did keep warm. And I kept myself busy, and I didn't sit in one spot when it was raining and try to keep myself completely dry because it was almost impossible. But if I kept moving, I found I could tolerate it. And I knew once you were all wet and there was nothing dry, you could say, well, I have nothing left to protect. So then you just went about as if you were perfectly dry. And it was a psychological thing with me that when I was soaking wet, I felt better than when I was half wet. And because half wet is half dry, and you knew which one you really wanted to be, but you didn't have a lot of choice. And so I was the real axe swinger. So my hands got very hard between digging in the ground, chopping roots, chopping tree limbs, a little pocket hatchet I had. My hands were very calloused after a short time. And fortunately later, it was very important that I had a real hard callus because I grabbed the end of an M1 rifle that I had fired and accidentally grabbed the end of the barrel, which was red hot. It just burned right down the middle of my right palm, and I could smell it. It smelled awful, but it didn't do any damage. It was just all on a hard callus, and it healed very rapidly. So I really came out of that in pretty good shape. So this is the way it went in the Vosges Mountains day after day. They were moving and stopping and moving, and we moved many different positions. One night, one wet, rainy night, we had to sleep on the top of the ground. We didn't have a chance to dig in, and we were told we were going to be moving up, so we were just going to stay here until we were given orders. And I spread my shelter half out to keep the rain off. And I fell asleep and woke up, and it was jet black in those forests. Even when it was there was a moon, it would be jet black because the clouds were so thick all the time. And I was really nauseated, and I felt just absolutely awful. And I just didn't know whether I'd be able to do anything. And a friend of mine, Johnny Nave from St. Louis, Missouri, came over and asked me what was the matter. And I said, I'm so sick, and I don't know what I'm going to do. And he said, I'll tell you what, when we move out, he says, just let me roll you, put your gear up for you. And he said, just get up on the truck. And he said, I'll take care of it, which he did. And I was eternally grateful for just that little thing. But he rolled up my gear and tied it up and threw it on the truck when we moved out. And within another 12 hours, I was feeling okay. And I wasn't sick again during the whole war. That was the only time. I never had a cold, I never had a cough, I never sneezed. And I ate whatever they put in front of me. I ate onions, and I hate onions because that was mixed in with stuff you had to eat if you wanted to eat, and I ate everything that was there, and I vowed if I ever got through this, I'd never eat another onion the rest of my life. My wife has suffered with that ever since, but I have adhered to that. That was for getting over that, and I survived it. And the Army chow, as you know, was nothing to rave about, but it wasn't much. Well, late in November comes Thanksgiving. Okay, we're moving all around the Vosges Mountains. Thanksgiving Day, they try to serve turkey to soldiers all around the world, wherever you are. And so we were told that the kitchen was setting up back for Thanksgiving dinner, but we were in a forward position, and we couldn't just walk away from it until somebody else took our place. Well, after a few hours, they told us to pull the gun out of that position we were going to move anyway and go back and get our dinner. So we went back to get our Thanksgiving dinner, and the kitchen had put the dinner out and left about 2 hours before. And it had continued to rain, as it had been doing in France the whole time we were there, on and off. And they put it out in mess kits, and they had mashed potatoes and gravy and turkey and ice cream and pie and string beans, and everything was heaped up in an open mess kit. And it had been out in the rain, so it was also full of water, and the ice cream had melted down on everything, and the mess kit was full of water, and that was Thanksgiving dinner. It's our big turkey dinner, and ice cold. But it tasted good, I guarantee you. If you were like me, it was food, and we ate it a la mode, but it was good. And so it went. That was our Thanksgiving dinner. In the meantime, of course, we tried to write letters home whenever we could get a dry spot, these little V-mail things. And I remember just writing home, well, it's been busy here, you know, and so forth. I'm fine. I hope you're all fine, and so forth. And you weren't supposed to tell them anything about what we were doing. And being a young kid, I was dumb enough that I didn't keep a diary, which I really, truly regret. If I'd have kept a diary, I would have been able to write a lot more of the details down, and I'm able to remember it because the timing is way off on some of this. But then we moved up. Thanksgiving in December, we were moving closer and closer to the Maginot Line, which meant we were getting closer to Germany, because on the other side of the Maginot Line was the Rhine River, and in that area was the Siegfried Line, and that's what we were shooting for. But it was getting into, we were in December, and we've been through this kind of shifting and moving and so forth for quite some time. There was never any real elaborate major fixed battles. There were lots of little smaller battles and all, and we had yet not fired our anti-tank gun at anything. We hadn't seen a tank, and we were just simply put in different places to protect against tank attack. But in the mountains, it wasn't much of a problem. In 1970, I went back to the area and took Freddie, my wife into an area, a little town up in the mountains called Freakenrup. It's way back in the middle of nowhere. And the reason I remembered it is because late one day we were moving around a mountain, and I mean around it. There was a goat trail, I guess, going around this mountain, and we were following it with our weapons carrier and pulling our gun, and of course the infantry line troops were marching along in a single file. Here we were coming along with a truck on this where there was no road, and we were leaning over quite a bit. And by the time we got up to where we were going to break out of this, a number of jeeps had turned over and rolled down the slope, and they had to send people down to get them up and then winch them back up and pull them up. But our truck held in position. We got off and walked. And the driver had to sit in the truck and drive it, and all we could do was offer him a hand or something if something happened and try to get him out. But we didn't slip. And when we got over the top of this, we came in on a flat area, and down below was a little town, and that was the town of Freakenrup, which we entered from the rear. And a few of the soldiers who were up in front of us were the first ones into the town, and we came right in behind them, maybe 10 minutes later. And they had already captured all the Germans that were in the town. They were in a little inn there, and they rounded them all up. And while we got there, the prisoners were being brought down, and we went in, and town people were out there cheering and yelling. The Americans were here, and they were coming out, and they were bringing us apples and wine. And this was the first town that we really were in a month's time. We hadn't been in a town. We'd been in the mountains and in the woods, so we were never in where we could sleep indoors or anything. And so then we were in that town, and we were going to stay there the night and sleep in barns and stuff like that, and haylofts were fine, at least were dry. And we stayed there, and I met a family, a young woman who was 20 years old, had a little baby, and her son had been taken as by the Germans as a laborer. You know, they took French civilians back to Germany to work in the factories. This was against the Geneva Convention, but they did it anyway. And it turns out her husband never did get home. And the woman herself died years later, and the young son grew up to be a baker in Schermek, which is the next big town, and where Freddie and I had stopped by. Not far away was a concentration camp, which we didn't really know about at the time. Well, we got up on the top of that hill, and we could look across into what I guess you would call the Rhine Plain. We could see it where it flattened out, and we were at the edge of the Vosges Mountains, and we got a look at it. When orders came to go back down the mountain on the road on the other side, we were going back into the forests and moving up north east of where we were at that time. And this was down closer to Strasbourg in that area, and then we were going up into the Maginot at a different area. And we went through a series of towns then, and there were a lot of city fighting and so forth, and we still hadn't seen any tanks or shot our anti-tank gun. We just moved along, and we were in position. We pulled guard duty, and we moved along, and we were where we were supposed to be with the soldiers, but most of the time there were no tanks because the hills were so steep that there was just not a terrain for tanks. And we got up into an area which was close to a breakout towards the Maginot Line, and a town called Lemberg, and we went back there in 1972, and that town was under siege at the time by our 1st Battalion, and they took severe casualties during the day. And that evening, while the 1st Battalion was trying to capture Lemberg, 2nd Battalion was in reserve, my outfit. And they said, you guys are going to get a movie tonight. They found a theater here in this town, one of the other towns, and it's just down the road here a mile, and you can take your trucks down there and as many guys as you can carry, and you're going to see a movie. So, hey, we thought that would be great. We got down, they had coffee, and I think they had donuts, I don't remember. And we got down there, and the movie was Saratoga Trunk with Ingrid Bergman and Gary Cooper. And boy, everybody was in love with Ingrid Bergman. She was beautiful, and here we were in the middle of the woods in the war, and we're going to see Ingrid Bergman. And so they started showing the movie, and everybody's cheering when they started, and we're having a great time. This is great. We're indoors, and we're seeing a movie. And of course, these are dirty, dirty soldiers. They're muddy, half wet, drying out, steam coming off of them from being in close together, you know, and there was warm in there, warming up faster. And somewhere about midway through the movie, they turned on the lights, all 2nd Battalion return to your positions immediately. So the 2nd Battalion started letting loud noises go up that weren't exactly complimentary, and lots of bitching went on. And the 1st Battalion cheered. Those are the ones that were with us, because the rest of their troops were up forward. We had a small number of them. 3rd Battalion, I think, had some representatives there. They were cheering as the 2nd Battalion went out. And they said, get on with the movie. Get them out, get on with the movie. And we got out and moved on up again. And we were getting ready to take the 1st Battalion's place, because they had taken a terrible beating from German artillery the day before, going into Lemberg. And they wanted to move anti-tank guns up and protect them. They had captured most of Lemberg, and our troops had moved in and were finishing that. And then we were coming up. So the following day, we were going to move our anti-tank guns in place to protect them. And that night, I pulled guard duty in a town that was right near Lemberg. I don't know the name of the town. And I was out. We pulled various guard duty shifts. Sometimes we'd be up for 2 hours. Sometimes it would be one. You'd be on 2 hours and off 4. You might be on 1 and off 2. It depended on how bad the situation was and how many guards they wanted awake. And this was in a town, so it wasn't where we needed a lot of guys. I was on guard for 4 hours. And that would be all I would pull then for that 8-hour shift. And I was just walking around a bunch of trucks that had been parked in there, keeping my eye on things to be sure there wasn't anybody else taking things out of them and so forth. And I came up to a truck that was loaded, and I couldn't make out what was on the truck. I just couldn't quite figure out what it was. There were a bunch of white things piled in the back of this truck, and I didn't recognize them as anything I could tell. So it was pretty dark, and so I reached out with my hand. I could just see the images. And I reached out and to see what this was. I put my hand in there, and I felt a nose and hair and I think eyeglasses. And I had my hand on the head of a dead soldier who was in a mattress cover. And these 3 trucks were loaded with bodies, bottom to top, from B Company, 1st Battalion, from that morning attack where they had taken a beating. And I just pulled my hand back in kind of horror. And it was kind of solemn standing around there with all these bodies, and I was the only one alive. And made me stop and think a little bit about, what could happen to any of us. But somehow or other at that point, I still wasn't thinking I was going to get killed. I thought I might get wounded, but I never thought I'd be killed. And I guess that was the 18-year-old. So I was relieved of guard duty finally, and I told the other guy coming on, what was around there. And I said, don't go exploring like I did. And then we moved on up into Lemberg the next day. I don't know how much of this you want me to continue with. I'll be happy.
If I put my feet up.
You're on, huh? The town of Lemberg stands out in my memory because we were in it for a while, but not that we were in it so long, but it sort of hit a point in the war where I had to make a major decision in my philosophy of life. And it's stayed with me pretty much ever since that time. Up to Lemberg, we were in a lot of areas where didn't know where we were. We didn't know where the Germans were. We knew approximately, how far away they were. We were shelled any number of times in different places, some closer than others, and always under the threat of shelling coming in right on us. And a lot of the times, of course, it was because they couldn't see us. We were on the other side of the mountain or something like that. We got to Lemberg, we began to get out in more open country, and the forests were beginning to diminish. Lemberg was a city, small town. It had a railroad crossing at the entrance to the town in the direction we came in, which was the Lemberg-Bitche Railroad, B-I-T-C-H-E. Bitche was a Maginot fortress town, one of the major fortresses. It also was the place that had an old 13th century fortress in the middle of the town, which had 11-foot thick walls that was being used by the Germans as a secure headquarters base. It couldn't be bombed, it couldn't be shelled, they were just perfectly safe in it. The foot soldiers were up ahead of us, fought their way into Lemberg, house to house, and we were to come up the next morning and bring our anti-tank guns into position, and it was all set up for us to meet up with a Sherman tank And this was American medium tanks, which had, most of them at that time had 75 millimeter guns on them, which was really under armored or underpowered for what tanks really should have. Later tanks had 90 millimeter guns, which would be much more effective. At any rate, we were supposed to meet up with a tank that was going to lead us up the hill into position. We were to go through the middle of town, up a hill, along a ridge which was paralleling this Bitch-Lemberg Railroad, which was down below. We got to the town and we couldn't see anybody. We were following directions and we came into this town and there wasn't anybody around. There was just not a sign of life, and it was just deserted. And we knew the town had been partially cleared, but we didn't know what part. We didn't know whether where we were it was clear or not. We could assume it was. We couldn't imagine they would tell us to go in this way if it wasn't. But we didn't see anybody. So the squad leader decided, Sergeant Smith from Connecticut, that what we should do is go up, scout it out, and see if we could find anybody before we pull the whole rig down there and have the truck and the gun and most of the squad stay behind. So Smitty, the second lieutenant we had at the time, Lieutenant Cohen, decided that we would go down, and they were going to take me with them, and left the sergeant with the rest of the squad, and the squad leader, Sergeant Smith, went down with the lieutenant. So here I was with a .45 pistol, walking down a road into a deserted town, and the other two had carbines, and I didn't feel very comfortable with just a pistol. I didn't know what I was going to do with a pistol. And we got down across the railroad tracks, and there was something in the middle of the road, and we walked down the road, and the closer we got to it, it looked like some GI clothing. I couldn't tell exactly what it was. And I walked up closer to it, and right on the long side of it was a Thompson submachine gun in perfect condition with a full clip in it, and I picked that up very quickly. And I looked down, and the stuff I couldn't identify was the remains of an American soldier who had been ground into the road by a tank. I mean, he was hardly recognizable, but you could tell it was a body. It was kind of grisly. But the machine gun hadn't been touched. Whatever crushed him didn't damage the machine gun. At any rate, down the road about another 50 yards on the left side was an American tank that was off, had lost the tread and was off the side of the road. Wasn't anybody around it either. It was deserted. So we were looking for anything in the windows, and I was looking at a house off on the right, and the third floor window has some movement. And I just jumped aside there to look up there, and there's just curtains blowing, just eerily. You know, this is very spooky. It's just curtains and nobody. And could have been somebody inside, but if it was a sniper, he could have finished us off very easily before we got that far. Where I was only about 25 yards away from the house. So we walked a little further, and down the road, about 50 yards, we saw a couple of American soldiers. So we were okay. So we walked on down and talked to them, and they said they were in houses all around, that there was only the far eastern edge of town that was still not clear. But the road we needed was cleared all the way up to the ridge, and that the rest of the troops had come through there, and they were already in position up on the top of the hill. Those were our E, F, and G company were our three line companies. So we went back and got our weapons hauler and climbed on board, and then drove down through the town, and there wasn't any tank there. I guess the tank that was knocked out was the one we were supposed to meet, but nobody there knew this. We were given those orders, but nobody knew, and they said, well, there isn't any tank. But that's where you get up there. So we started up this road, and we got about 3/4 of the way up the road, and we could look across a little valley a few hundred yards on the other side. Was the other, you know, we're out of it, looked down beyond the edge of town, across the valley and up the other side. And apparently that's where the German line was, which was only a few hundred yards away. And we're in plain view. So as we went up this road, we're 3/4 of the way up, this tremendous barrage of mortar shells came down on the road, right on the road. I mean, they had it zeroed in beautifully. And they hit the rooftops all around us and hit the road up in front of us and behind us, completely missed the truck. We were right in the middle of all this, and by that time everybody had jumped off and ducked into the houses and into the basements, and they were full of American soldiers just down there waiting to move, taking their time, smoking cigarettes and eating or drinking or whatever, and basically relaxing in a nice secure cellar. So we got back out, and our lieutenant was having a conniption. He was coming unglued. He was absolutely a nervous wreck. He was trembling, his eyes were darting in all directions. He said, we can never get through that. He said, they just landed all over us. And nobody was hurt, nobody had been hit. And he said, we've got to get out of here, we can't go through. So he gave orders to the truck driver to let this thing roll backwards, not regulate the engine or anything. Keep the engine running and let it go down without making any more noise than he absolutely had to. And he took us, we got down where we could turn around and go back out of there. We went back to battalion headquarters and pulled out and didn't get through. So he took 2 gun squads out, and we spent the next afternoon and night down near battalion headquarters while they discussed what they were going to do. And that night down in the valley we heard a lot of small arms fire up above and machine gun fire, and we could tell there was German patrols active because you could hear where they were moving by the sound of the fire and so forth. And then finally at one point we heard a couple of Schmeisers fire and long blasts, and then an American heavy machine gun opened up, and they had a very definitive heavy bum 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 bum, a loud banging noise, and we knew that was a heavy water-cooled American machine gun, and it fired a number of bursts, and then everything got quiet. The American machine gun was the last noise that was made, and that was the end of the patrol activity. So whatever happened, it was stopped. And so we spent the night waiting there, and the next day we were ordered to move up the hill, and we'd heard something bad had happened, but we didn't know what was going on. And we were ordered to get back up the hill and in position, but without our lieutenant. The lieutenant was gone. We didn't know what had happened to him. Somebody came down from headquarters, gave orders to a squad leader, and told us what to do. And we went back into town the same way. We went up the hill the same way, and just kept going up the hill. And this time we didn't hit any mortar fire. We got up on the road and went down the road, and we're up out of town now, and the forest begins closing down on us again. We're going down the road. On the right side of the road, there were a bunch of American soldiers around up here. On the right side of the road, I see this guy laying on his stomach on the side of the road, and I look down, and another fellow looked down, and it was Captain Howard, the first man I told you about. He was a new replacement for E Company commander. He's a captain, and we had met him 3 days earlier on a road in a town, 3 towns before we got here. He came up and talked with us. We were giving each other haircuts. The weather was a little clear, and we were getting haircuts for the first time in a while. We were just shearing hair off, you know, and get rid of it. And he came by and kidded around. He was new. He'd just come over as a replacement. He was taken over E Company because E Company commander had been wounded and sent back. And he asked us about how we were doing and so forth and so on. And we told him. He was a very friendly guy, a likable guy, and no military baloney, you know. He was just there. And finally he left, and he wished us luck, and we said the same to him. And I looked down, and this was Captain Howard's body. 3 days in the combat zone, and he was dead. His war was over. I mean, soldiers come and they go, but I don't know anybody that I met who had a shorter war than this man. He came up there, he was a replacement, he took over a company, he was wounded, he was not killed instantly. He gave his maps to somebody else to give to the executive officer of the company when they were up on the fighting, and the fighting take the ridge, and he died in the middle of the road, and they put him over on the side of the road where he was waiting for the face down, waiting for the Graves Registration Service to come up. Now, I don't know if you know what Graves Registration are, but they're the men that come up on the battlefields and pick up all the bodies. German, anybody, civilian, American soldiers, and they take them back and identify them and bring them back where they can be processed and sent back for record purposes and for burial. And they go back to the military cemeteries, wherever they're doing that. And they usually drive a Jeep, and they haul a small trailer, and if they need more, they'll get these little trucks like the ones that I had found the night before, were loaded with bodies. And they hadn't come up yet. It was still early in the day. And we were going up that road. I don't remember what time of day it was, because as we got down the road, another 100 yards, we came upon the body of a German soldier. I think he was looked like he might have been in SS uniform, but I don't know. Sometimes they're paratroop uniforms and all different, regular soldiers, green-gray uniform. But this guy was in full battle gear, but he was dead in the middle of the road. And what he did was he marked the high water of a German counterattack against the American lines, which had occurred right at dawn and ran for a few hours before we came in and was over. And Germans had sent a combat team in loaded with Schmeiser submachine pistols. Everybody had a machine pistol. And two what we call flak wagons. They had a 20 millimeter cannon on the top, which was behind a little armored shield on the back of the truck and swiveled around up and down in all directions, and there was an armored vehicle with a track. And they bring those in and they'd use those against personnel. And they were very effective if you didn't have a good anti-tank defense. And they came in and they just did tremendous damage to F Company, which was where we were supposed to be. And we got up in there, and right in the middle of a crossroad there, which was the Bitch Crossroad, through this clearing, was the body of another officer I knew, Lieutenant Breckenridge, who was from F Company. He was a very popular, bright, red-haired guy, a very young fellow, probably 23 or so. And he was right in the middle of the crossroad, and there were other F Company bodies scattered around there. I don't know how many were killed. But they had gotten hit by this combat patrol and two flak wagons and supposedly a light tank. And they had no armored defense. They didn't have anti-tank guns. They had one bazooka, and they should have had at least two more bazookas, but for some reason they didn't. And their one bazooka man went up and he did his job, and he fired at this thing, and he missed. It went over the top of it, and they cut him down, and they couldn't retrieve the bazooka. And then they came up and they just fired into foxholes and everything, and F Company did what they could, but their defense was very feeble, and they took a tremendous beating with tremendous wounded and killed. And that was the position we were supposed to have occupied the night before, and the Germans knew we didn't get through because they were watching. And when they shelled us with mortars and all, they knew what we were, and we hadn't gotten through. And then they attacked that night. They must have known that they didn't have any tank weapons up there. So they hit an outfit with armor that was defenseless against armor. And we really felt pretty bad about that. And the F Company guys, seeing the anti-tank guns coming up, were delighted to see us. You know, they were, thank God we got some anti-tank support up here. And we were feeling guilty that we weren't there the day before. And if we were, who knows what might have happened. You know, we might have done a lot of good. We might not be here the next afternoon, because you never know what's going to happen. And at any rate, we dug our guns in. We had two of them side by side at that crossroad, and we stayed there all day. And there were some other shells came in, but nothing real bad. And that night it was jet black. I dug a foxhole alongside a tree, right up against the tree, and I was really almost getting unnerved myself. You know, as it got dark, I was getting very unhappy because I was having trouble at that time with my hearing. I didn't know it, but my hearing was beginning to get bad. And I had good night vision, but there wasn't any moonlight, and at night it was just jet black in these forests. And I looked at which way the Germans had come, and we were right in the line of the attack. If they came back again, we would be right in front of everything. And the guy to the left of me was a F Company fellow. His buddy was killed, and he asked me if I wanted to share his foxhole, and I said, no, I have to stay up here near the gun. And he said, well, okay, but he said he didn't have a buddy. His buddy had been killed. And if anybody wanted to come, he already had a good foxhole, and he'd be very delighted to have him share it. So I went back and told the sergeant that if somebody wanted to stay there, this guy already had a hole and wouldn't have to dig in. And I said, he's all by himself here. His buddy's been killed. So why don't we let him pull guard with us so that he doesn't have to be alert himself all that time. And so we incorporated him into our rotation, and he was just very grateful. And he was really in good shape. He wasn't, acting terrified or shell-shocked or anything, but I was getting that way. And all of a sudden, somewhere after I dug my foxhole and all, a round of shell fire came into the area, and I just took off at the first blast and dove for my foxhole, and I slid across it into the foxhole and butted up against the base of the tree, and I hit so hard I thought I was going to knock myself out. And I thought, that's crazy. You could have broken your neck. And I said, what am I doing that for? I hadn't done that up to this point. I ducked and rolled down and all that, but I hadn't done a panic dive before. And that was the height of it for me. Right then and there, I decided that that was not going to happen again. I might get wounded, I might get killed, anything might happen. But if it was going to happen, there are a lot of ways it could happen that I couldn't do anything about. So I became very much a fatalist. From that point forward, whatever happened was going to happen, and I would do my best. But I wasn't going to do anything stupid to make it easy for the Germans or anybody else. And I lived that way after that. And so from that point on, I was never terrified like that again. There were some tight moments later, but I never had that feeling of almost being out of control. And I think probably a lot of soldiers reach that point. And then some of them later may go back the other way. They may, then begin to get really the constant pressure of it might overcome them, and then they collapse at some point. And I'm sure that probably did happen, and it might have happened to me too, but it didn't. So anyway, the next day, or that afternoon, the grave registration came up and picked up all these people. And there's some additional little stories, but I won't go into them. Essentially, they cleared the battlefield, and the Germans did not attack again. And our group was given instructions to move to different positions. And what we had heard in the meantime, a few days later, maybe a week later, I'm not sure what it was, that something bad had happened up in the north, and that we were going to be moving into defensive positions. And what it was the Battle of the Bulge had happened. And they were pulling artillery and other infantry, shifting them up to the north to deal with the Bulge. Everybody just sort of sidestepped as the 3rd Army moved to the north and got prepared to move into the Bulge. The 7th Army moved up to fill up the 3rd Army position. Then pretty soon the 100th Division was covering a 3-division front with very thin lines. And we then went into defensive positions. And there was sporadic shell fire and all, and sporadic patrolling back and forth. Every night you were on guard duty, you had to look out for German patrols coming in and so forth. But although they did come in, they never came right in our positions. And we didn't encounter any immediate actions like that. But we always had our guns in position to defend on roadblocks and so forth. And we stayed in the Bitch area until March. In different positions. People came through the lines. We captured a guy we thought was a spy one night who tried to get through the line, was picked up by our pickets and sent to the back, and he claimed he was an Alsatian and he was just coming from the next town and he lived in this town, and turned him over to the guys in the back and they check him out, because you couldn't tell whether the Alsatians were German sympathizers or whether they were French sympathizers, and an awful lot of them were sympathetic with the Germans. So they had cartoons with the Nazi flag in the back of the house, an American flag in the front of the house, and that was enough. All the soldiers knew what that meant, so we didn't take any chances with them. And although we felt comfortable in the towns, we didn't take any chances out in the woods with the civilians and all. So we didn't see any more tanks or anything, and we heard them later, but didn't see any. And while we're in the positions around Bitch, we had mostly guard duty, monotonous guard duty, until January 1st. When the German offensive in the Ardennes failed and the Battle of the Bulge ended, the Germans immediately shifted everything in a swift move to our front. They knew what we'd done, and this was a chess move. They were moving first. They were the white and we were the black. And we had moved up there to counter them, and they were moving down here now to take advantage of what they knew to be weakened lines in our area. And they, well, just before, well, we got to Christmas. I skipped over Christmas. In Christmas, just before Christmas, and during the Battle of the Bulges moving, we moved up into another position to put in a roadblock. We were actually about 3 miles way out in front of the front line. And these roadblocks were pretty popular in those days. They took us because we had 50 caliber machine gun, we had a couple of 30 caliber machine guns we picked up. There were 10 men that all had small arms and the anti-tank gun. So they put us on a roadblock and set up all these weapons, and we were a roadblock. We knew we couldn't hold a major attack. What we would do is put up resistance and then pull back, and the rest of the group were back in putting in defensive positions, and we were simply there to stall for time. But very often you didn't get a chance to pull back. You would get overrun very quickly. And that's how a lot of people were captured and disappeared. They ended up missing. We were in position at this roadblock, and we had it all set up, and we had a good position, and everything was dug in, and we heard a motor coming towards us down the road in front of us from the German line direction. And we saw a German Jeep coming. Couldn't make out much of it, so we set up and we're all ready for him. We said we might as well let him come in before we do anything. We were all ready to open fire, and we saw the Jeep come around this position where we were going to open up, and he had a white star painted on it, the American insignia. And, you know, what is this? So when this thing came down the road, a couple of us went out and stopped him, and it had American soldiers in it. And of course we hadn't even heard at that point that the Germans were using American uniforms and coming through, you know, in acting as if they were American soldiers. But these guys all spoke English very American, and they were scared to death. And they had been out there with some field artillery observers and were coming back, and they'd gotten lost. And they were coming down this road, and all of a sudden, you know, they couldn't find anybody they knew, and the first people they hit, and they see an anti-tank gun aimed right at them with a bunch of machine guns, and they were just having troubles. And we found out who they were and convinced ourselves they were okay, and we let them go. We told them, if I were you, we'd set this thing on fire and steal an American Jeep somewhere back in the rear, but don't go riding around in front this far in a German vehicle, because we didn't know you were Americans until you came down and stopped. And you were just within a hair of getting blown away. So they were very chagrined at their stupidity, and they agreed with that. At any rate, we then pulled back, and the first night we had to stop short of that. It was Christmas Eve, and it had snowed, and it was below freezing, and the snow had iced over it. And where we had to stop was no place to dig in. The ground was frozen. We couldn't dig holes. So I spent that night sleeping on a sleeping bag on top of a sheet of ice. And I was as cold as I've ever been any time in my life, and everybody was freezing. And it was just miserable. And the following morning, we pulled out of that and went back and then dug in at another spot. And then that was Christmas Day. And then they came back and told us we could pull back, and those that wanted to go to church services could go to church. And we went up the road a short ways, and there was a church there that was blown to pieces, and the sunshine was out then. It was not raining, and it was shining through this blasted out church steeple and coming right down on the altar. It was kind of an impressive sight. The pew was full of rock and rubble from the church had been shelled, and they had a Catholic service there with all the guys in the road with all their weapons and everything else, and that was Christmas. And sometime after that we ate, and sometime later we got mail, but I don't remember when. I just don't have a recollection of it. And then we pulled back further and went into other positions, which we dug in more permanent positions, and then rotated positions for every 2 weeks, and we got a week off in town in between, which puts you back about a mile behind the lines. And we were back there, and the sun came out one day, and we went out there to sun ourselves. It was a nice warm sun after being out and sleeping on the ice. And here comes a flight of thunderbolts flying right over us. And they were real low, and we watched them fly over. They'd been up in the lines. And it turns out they were flown by German pilots they had been captured, and they were flying American Thunderbolts with German pilots, and they were strafing selected targets. And they could see us, we're all out in the open there looking up at them, but they didn't bother us. And they went all over, and all of a sudden the guns up behind us, the anti-aircraft guns, opened up, and there was stuff flying all over the place. And you have to remember, what goes up comes down. So when they fire all this anti-aircraft stuff up in the air and it explodes up in the air, then all that stuff comes down, and it doesn't know where it's going to land, and you don't either. So shrapnel is falling all around everybody. It's landing on rooftops in the streets and town, bouncing all around everybody. And sometimes you get pretty badly hurt by this stuff. So we decided to take some shelter indoors, stay out of this, and that went on for about 15 or 20 minutes as these planes went over and around a couple of times and then disappeared. And at one point they strafed a bunch of troops in positions, but they didn't bother with the rear troops. Then we went back on our cycle of staying in positions until January 1st, when the Germans launched their counterattack against us, which they called Operation Nordwind, which was a fitful kind of attack. It wasn't like the Bulge. They didn't have the equipment they had up at the Bulge, but they came in almost banzai-type charges against some elements of the division. One machine gunner killed 100 Germans in front of his machine guns, a heavy machine gunner. And remember, it had frozen, and a lot of the machine gun belts were freezing up, and that they were in packed, and they were left there, and you don't manipulate them. You load your guns, you put them in, and they got snow and ice on them, and they froze. And so they had to keep freeing them and jam up. And so the soldiers figured out real fast they could just free them up real fast if they urinated on their machine gun belts, and that would free them up until they froze. But if you're using them, you'd use them before they froze. And so they did. And it was quite a battle there for a couple of days. But the Germans only succeeded in chasing the 17th Recon outfit, which was on our left flank. And you may remember, Freddie, the lawyer that I had helped me with. We had a problem with the fence in our Benning Street house. He was in the 17th Recon, and I reminded him that he had pulled out and left our flank exposed. And he said, yeah, he remembered that. He said he was happy to get out of there. And at any rate, that was, after that attack was over, I should back up a minute. At midnight, New Year's, I was on guard, and I was ready to go off guard. And I heard this strange noise and saw these strange lights in the sky in front of me. And I listened to them. I'm watching these lights, and they're going over and making us weirdly, ungodly sound. And I woke up Charlie Zimmerman, who was going to relieve me. And he says, get down. And he said, they're rockets. And they were Nebelwerfers, which was that big 240 or 270 millimeter German Nebelwerfer rocket, that big around. And when they exploded, they put out pieces of shrapnel like that, great big chunks of shrapnel. And they hit about that time off to our right. Well, they weren't too close. They threw dirt over us, but they weren't, that can go a long way. And Charlie pulled me down in the hole there, and I was just flabbergasted with this. It was a pretty sight, actually, watching these things come over, because you could see the fire on the rocket. And so they threw these over a number of times, and they hit Tom Goodrich and one of my Army buddies in New Mexico, and blew a wall out of the building he was in. But nobody was wounded, and none of our guys were wounded. And I was watching them, they set off another barrage of them behind the hill where they were shooting them off, and there was a great big explosion behind the hill, and one of them must have gone off by mistake right in the German, either in the gun or right after it was fired, but it blew up before it got up in the air. About that time, a small platoon came by of American soldiers. They were up in front of us. And the lieutenant came over and he said, you guys have to get out of here. He said, there's nothing between you now and Berlin except the German army. He said, all of us have pulled back to that area back there. And he said, you don't want to stay here. You don't have anybody protecting on either side. You're out in front of everything. And so we didn't have any orders to move. So we stayed there deliberating what should do, and all of a sudden German tracer bullets began cracking around us and over us. And we heard German voices in front of us, and one guy shouting, Otto, wo bist du? And so forth. and we decided that there are too many of them. We better get out of there. So we left our position and our gun and hightailed it back to where we knew the G Company headquarters was, and found the company commander there and told him what we'd done. And he said, well, he said, there's no way we could have protected you up there. He said, that's all right. He said, just stay here for now until we find out what to do. But he said, why don't you go up there and tell them where you heard the voices coming to the mortar squad, and tell them where the voices were coming from, and let them lay a barrage in those woods. So I went up there and we put a barrage of mortars in on the German positions. Well, I don't know whether they did any damage to them or not. But anyway, that attack ended that night, and the next day we went up in that position, and we'd been there 2 days with nothing but C rations. We hadn't seen our officer, and this was the third day. We hadn't had any food, and when we got back to C Company that day, we were hungry, and they had already eaten, and they gave us what was left in their thermite cans that they had brought up, and it was just scraps of stuff. And then our officer came up, and this was our second officer, who was a useless character. And he later wrote himself up for a Silver Star and so forth. He was drinking all the time, and he wasn't very good. Fortunately, we didn't need an officer. We functioned pretty much as an independent squad, as you probably surmised. Anyway, we went back and rescued our gun and brought it back and set it up in another position. And Freddie, I went back a few years ago, in 1970, and found this place that we stayed in. I thought it was part of the Maginot, but it really was just a water system. It didn't have water in it. It was a great big concrete bunker, and we stayed there. And that night and a few days, and then finally moved back to other positions in a little better positions. And then it was just sporadic from there until March, until we moved out and moved on up. And then we moved against the city of Bitch, and Bitch fell in a day. And all of a sudden, in a period of about an hour, we found ourselves in the rear echelon for the first time since we'd gotten overseas. And then we moved up, and believe it or not, we went across into Germany, and without our going into any further action, we drove down the middle of Neustadt en route to Ludwigshafen and crossed the Rhine at Mannheim over that Ludendorff Bridge, which had been blown into the Rhine, except we had a pontoon bridge right alongside of it. And I took pictures from my truck as we went over, and I have those pictures. And then we went through Mannheim, which was complete rubble, and there were just a few narrow areas where the streets had been cleared where we could get through. Otherwise, the rubble choked everything up. And the people were already out in the streets beginning to clear them away. You know, German people and civilians were out there very efficiently doing their thing. And then we moved on down further from there, and we had a number of other military experiences, but now we were in Germany, and we began to roll very fast. And we crossed the Rhine, the Neckar River at Heilbronn under a smoke screen, because the river was zeroed in by German artillery and defended by the 17th SS Division, and there was bitter fighting in Mannheim. And in the Knorr food factory, where I went to get away from German rockets another time, I found that microscope that you may remember I had when I was in medical school. It was in a pile of rubble in the Knorr food factory there. And I picked it up, knew what it was, but I had never seen one like it, and I took that with me and later managed to package it up and send it home, and I used that during medical school and later sold it. And Heilbronn was bitter fighting and lots of shelling and artillery work. On the outskirts of Heilbronn, we got held up by heavy fire from a factory, and they pulled us back a couple of 100 yards, and they had brought up a battery of 8-inch howitzers. You know, that's a big gun. And the 8-inch howitzers leveled this German factory by firing over our heads. And I've never heard anything like that. Those shells went over, they sounded like railroad trains going over, a rumbling sound. You could just hear them go and almost see them. And they just destroyed the factory, and we moved on in. And the room where we were staying while they did this, came a knock on a doorway, and the door opens, and in comes 2 German soldiers who'd been upstairs the whole time. They wanted to surrender. And we went upstairs to see if there were any more, and here they had a German machine gun pointing down the street where we'd come up. And there were too many Americans, so they didn't open fire, and these guys came down and surrendered. We were in a couple of hand grenades that could have done all kinds of damage to us. But this was the kind of a the guardian angel I had, that we didn't get in trouble. But we moved on from there and had a number of other episodes. It would take hours to go through them all, but we saw action finally with our anti-tank gun outside of Hockenheim, where we actually fired on a German farmhouse that was on top of a hill and was loaded with German soldiers who were using it as a fort and had pinned down E Company, one of our 3 line companies, in a field. And we rolled our gun down the hill and opened fire up on the top of the field on his farmhouse, just putting shell after shell through the farmhouse. It punched holes in him like Swiss cheese, and we fired right below the windows, hoping that the fracture of the concrete would shatter inside and drive anybody out. And within a matter of a half hour, I guess we fired some 55 rounds of anti-tank ammunition at this farmhouse, and when we stopped there was no return fire. And the troops got up in the field and went forward without any difficulty, no more casualties. During the time we were firing over the heads of our own soldiers, about that high, the anti-tank shell is 6 pounds. When that goes over your head, it makes your head, it makes a heck of a noise. Have you ever heard a rifle bullet that pops over your head? But anti-tank shells is a lot louder pop. And one of the soldiers under that broke up and came back just absolutely in a shambles. And his buddy brought him back, and his buddy had been shot through the thigh with a rifle bullet. And he brought this guy back, who was just a psychological disaster area. And he said he just couldn't take it. He said, that anti-tank gun is just horrible. And he said, we know it was doing us some good, but he said, this poor guy just couldn't stand it. So they took him back, and a lot of other wounded went back. And then we pulled out again, and another time we fired over the heads of some other soldiers and fired at a German company that was dug in on a hillside. And they stayed hidden. We didn't even know they were there until we were told to knock out some of these little wine sheds. You've probably seen the little sheds in the wine field where they kept the tools and stuff. And we wanted to blow those up in case there were anybody hiding in them. Now, I don't know why they would hide in the shed. Would be a bad place to hide. There's nothing else to hide in. So we just blew them up with some HE explosives. And when we did, a company of German soldiers that were laying on the ground in front of, all around this, we hadn't even seen them, about 300 yards away, got up and started running away with I can still see their overcoats flapping as they ran, and everybody opened fire on these guys. And a lot of them were brought down in the fire by everybody, and that's where I burned my hand on M1. I fired a whole bandolier of ammunition at that position, and that rifle barrel got pretty hot. But everybody was firing. And that about was the end of our active offensive combat there. We didn't get into any more with the anti-tank gun after that. But we fired a lot of rounds, as many, I guess, as anybody in our division did, at both buildings and other things, but we never fired at a tank and never fired at an armored car, mostly at fixed positions and things like that. Very accurate weapon. And we moved very quickly down into Germany and down through, we bypassed Heilbronn, which was an open city, and by agreement, and when we left Heilbronn, we went down to Stuttgart, ended the war in Stuttgart, Bad Cannstatt. I don't know if you know that, it's just a suburb of Stuttgart. And in Stuttgart, we had a couple of shows, the war ended there for us, and Jack Benny came through and put on a command performance, and later Bob Hope did. And I got to meet Ingrid Bergman in person.
Wow.
After all this, and I told her about the movie, and she laughed, and she autographed the card for us, and beautiful woman, boy.
How many medals did you get? Mentioned in your story.
What?
Medals. Did you get any medals?
Did I get any medals? Oh, I got a Bronze Star, but they gave out Bronze Stars to all infantrymen, and they gave you an extra Bronze Star if you had a combat infantry badge. And the combat infantry badge was given to all infantrymen who were under enemy fire. And the irony of it was that, I told you about the first casualties I saw were by mortar shells that did all the damage, and that flew in that fellow's jaw. And that was mortars. And we were told we weren't going to get them until we had been proven to be under small arms fire. And there was a big uproar from the infantry line saying, look, you idiots, it's mortar shells that do the damage. And we've been getting it day after day. and that was rescinded very rapidly, and all of us got our infantry badges, and that meant you got $10 extra a month for hazard pay. Wasn't that something? So yeah, I didn't get the Purple Heart. I was never wounded, and one man in my squad lost his leg after the war was over. A grenade must have lost a pin, and it exploded in a compartment where we carried rifle grenades, and they all exploded. And he stood up when he heard the thing go off, and it took his leg off at the hip. He was our driver all through the war, and he's since died of unknown causes. The squad leader we had through most of the war up into April, Charlie Smith, picked up all the German, when we went to German towns, we told them bring in their cameras and their pistols and their rifles, any weapons. And they brought in lots of rifles, some were 22, some shotguns and so forth. And he fired a 22 that somebody brought in, and it exploded out the breech, and he lost an eye. So he was sent home. And Charlie Smith became the squad leader, and then I became the acting squad leader after that. And at one point, I was a squad leader when they sent Charlie on pass to Paris. But I never got promoted. I didn't get my sergeant stripes until after the war was over. And I was a provost sergeant in a prisoner of war camp. And I ended up a buck sergeant with that. And I really...
Promotion.
What?
You had yourself promoted.
I was the company clerk before I got to be the provost. And as company clerk, I submitted my name for promotion, and the lieutenant signed the form. You know, sort of like in MASH, where you remember when radar used to give papers to the captain and to the colonel, and I would type up the reports and how many prisoners we had, who'd been sent home, and all that stuff. And then I'd send in any stuff that needed to be done, any orders. And I always put myself in for promotion. So in 2 months, I got myself promoted to buck sergeant, and that meant when I came home on a ship, I was a non-com. So I didn't have to pull KP. I could go and direct lines, but I didn't even have to stand in line. You know, I was really a high-ranking guy. And when I went into Kierweiler after the war in Hambach, they thought I was a very high-ranking man for somebody who was so young. Because I met all of those people later and told them that we had come through that area.
How about meeting your relatives in Germany after the war?
Well, in February of '46, my grandmother had written to me and told me that, you know, where the relatives were from and all. And then when I got transferred out of the division, I was sent to Mannheim, and that's when I went to and became a non-com in a prisoner of war camp. And so I had access to vehicles, and I borrowed a 2.5-ton truck one day, and I drove down across the Rhine and went to Kierweiler. And when I went into Kierweiler, it was a bad day, and when I got there, there wasn't anybody there. They were all over in, what's the town near that begins with an S? The bigger town. Has the big cathedral and bells.
Speyer.
Speyer. They were all at Speyer to Anna and August Moss's wedding.
Oh.
And so I talked to the neighbors and told them who I was, and they were all excited and everything. And I told them they said everybody would be there if you can come back in a week or 2 weeks, whatever it was. I agreed to come back, and I told them when I would come back, and then I borrowed a vehicle again and went back. And that time, everybody was ready, you know, and then everybody was related to me. I don't know how many different relatives I saw. We went all around the town, different houses, and the schnapps and cooking all kinds, and wine of all kinds that had been hidden away. And it was just a great time. But I didn't understand enough German to know what all they were saying, except they were my Großmutters, Schwesters, something or other, you know, cousin's cousin, and so forth. And they were all, it was a happy time and a lot of fun. But that was the last time I got back. I didn't get back there again. And Trudel, I met Trudel there then, and Lena, and I met the Weiss family, and Tante Gretel, and I met her son and daughter, and let's see, it was Werner, who hadn't gotten home yet. He was in a prisoner of war camp in the British territory. We each had our areas. They were in, excuse me, they were in the French area, And the Americans were on the other side of the Rhine, and he was a prisoner of the British. And Franz had come back and just walked through the lines. And I think he believed he outsmarted the Americans, you know, and put on civilian clothes and walked back. And we were so sick of taking German prisoners, you know, we couldn't care less. We didn't care where they went, just as long as we didn't have to deal with them. There were, at points, there were just hundreds of prisoners coming at us. At one point, where I fired the gun, we were in the middle of firing a gun when a whole platoon of Germans came up behind us and surrendered to me. And I'm standing there with my .45 pistol and a platoon of Germans with their flag, telling them to put their hands up and on their heads and all. And there were 30 of them, and there were 3 of us. And they surrendered, which was very kind of them. So we sent them back to the rear.
Well, is this, at what point is this in the war?
This was when we were firing at the farmhouse. During that, you know, it'd take a while for me to get the sequence there. It was very busy, but while we were firing, we were getting instructions and so forth from people. A major battalion commander was behind us, and our lieutenant came up and was trying to give us directions about what to do. And while we were doing that, then we finally got the order to cease fire. And when I saw this over my shoulder, I saw this flag waving on this side road, and here came the Germans up this side road. And by that time, the people behind me had left, so there wasn't anybody behind us. There were just 3 of us there, and all I had was my pistol. And I had, at many points during the war, picked up M1 rifle and carried a rifle because I didn't want to get caught with just a pistol. And I fired it a number of times, and if I got it dirty or whatever it might have done, I just throw it away and pick up another one. There's always rifles are new ones, hard to find new ones, and clean them up and use them. But I kept the pistol all during the war, and I have one now like it, but not the original. But that was, I had a charmed life, really. We all did in my squad, because when I went in one little town of Friekenrup, I went around the corner in Friekenrup and ran head on into 2 German soldiers. And they both had rifles on their shoulders, and they looked at me startled, you know, and I'm standing there and my pistol's in my holster, and they threw their rifles down and said, we surrender. So I pull out my pistol and, you know, come this way, and I'd say, hey, I caught a couple of more. And I didn't catch anybody. They caught themselves. And we had others come in like that, too. We went up to get snipers out of Cade, and we'd go chasing snipers up a hill.
How about when you went to the wine cellar and had a good time?
He wants military history.
Well, nah, he wants...
He's not got any more tape on there.
Well,
Pete, we crossed the Rhine at Mannheim, as I told you, and we were enjoying the fact that we were not way up in the front lines. The 100th Division was in the line 135 days straight, which at the time we hit 135 days was a European record for constantly being in contact with the enemy. But periodically we were in reserve a little bit. You know, if you were a mile out of the line for an infantry soldier, you thought you were in heaven. And even 100 yards could be great. Well, when we crossed the Rhine, we were way back. And we were billeted for the night. Just immediately on the other side of the Rhine, there was a big factory. And the factory had a nightclub. And we were being billeted there in the area that this nightclub occupied and recreational facility. There were some bunks and things in there. And somebody found that they had a wine cellar in this light nightclub. Well, the whole battalion was in this area. And everybody in the battalion came pouring into the wine cellar. And we went down and each grabbed a couple of bottles of wine. We didn't know what we had. And none of us had corkscrews to get the corks out. So we literally had to break the necks off the bottles. So here we were in reserve, and so we started drinking wine and singing and having a great time. Crossed the Rhine, morale was great. And late that evening, about 10:30 or 11 o'clock, we were soused to the gills. And they said that Red Cross had set up coffee and donuts and, in this club. So we went down there, and I had found a violin. And I had taken violin lessons many years ago, as you may or may not know. It was painful, it was terrible, and it lasted 6 weeks, and that was the end of the violin lesson. At any rate, I picked up the violin, and I could hit a little bit of Drink to Me Only with Thine Eyes. Just pick it out, you know. And I walked in there with this violin and ran into the company commander, Captain Hansen. Captain Hansen had no sense of humor. Unfortunately, we rarely ever saw him because we were a line outfit and the headquarters company was behind the line. And I said, "Good evening, sir." And I played Drink to Me Only with Thine Eyes. And he just turned around and walked away. And we had our coffee and donuts and went back and all fell asleep. And I was on guard duty and I went on the front seat of the truck and stretched out and went sound asleep. You know, I couldn't have been feeling better about sleeping on guard duty any time in my life. We were way behind the lines. So anyway, the next morning we all woke up and we were not feeling too well. And there was the residual of a lot of sick soldiers. And we were a mess. And somebody came up looking for me and told me to report to the company commander. Yeah. So Lacey and Shade and Don Fernbck go down and report to the company commander. All three of us are PFCs. Company commander lines us up at attention and says, "Gentlemen, you were accused of conduct unbecoming a soldier." This is the first time we haven't been fighting, you know, in essence, or in combat. And we're being accused of conduct unbecoming a soldier. And it shortly before that, we had seen this cartoon in Stars and Stripes. And it's a great cartoon. And it's Willie and Joe. You remember they were miserable, dirty-looking, disheveled, muddy feet, muddy clothes, beards. They just looked awful. And they're both slumping at this place in town, leaning against the wall, just relaxing, just totally limp. And this young shaved-tail lieutenant comes by, all spiffed up, and he says, "Well, at least when you're not fighting, you could look like soldiers." And they, you know, we just thought that was great. And here this guy is saying this, and we couldn't believe him. And he said, "I'm sorry to do this. I regret it, I sincerely do, but discipline has to be enforced." And he said, "I'm going to have to reduce you in rank." God, PFC to private. You know, we couldn't contain ourselves. We couldn't wait to get out of there. And we got outside and we just collapsed laughing. You know, we laughed for about a half hour straight. It cured our hangovers. And we laughed so hard, we were afraid this guy was going to hear us and come after us. And so we went back bragging, you know, about how we had accomplished a feat that's not seen very frequently in the U.S. Army annuals, that we're relieved of combat service and reduced in rank for not behaving like soldiers. And it was a farce. And so I wrote a letter home to my mother and father, PVT, underlined 3 lines, you know, and wrote the letter and says, "Do not be concerned. We crossed the Rhine, we went to found a nightclub, had some wine, had a big party, and I got busted." And I said it was worth every minute of it. It's going to cost me money, you know, $4.80 reduction in pay. And a month later, this officer was removed from command for alcoholism and shipped back. And the company was taken over by Lieutenant Gilbert, who was a very fine officer. And there were a lot of good ones around, even there were a lot of bad ones. And Lieutenant Gilbert immediately reinstored us to our prior ranks. And we were PFCs again. And that was, you know, that was something that couldn't have happened at a better time to the right people. And Shade and Lacey were just as proud as I was that we got busted. We said, you know, we're like Sergeant, what's his name, who in G Company. He was a big, rough and ready guy. You're about to run out of tape. And he was always being busted from sergeant to private. And when they needed a patrol to go out, they'd make him a sergeant again until he could lead the patrol. He was the best they had. So it was a funny war for me. Good times, bad times, but an adventure. Pete, you asked me about Hockenheim. I didn't mention Hockenheim. That's not too far from Mannheim, is it?
No.
And I know they have auto races there. When we went in Hockenheim, I didn't know it was a race town or anything. I don't know if the racetrack was there then. But I can tell you, we went in there and we were supposed to be going with our line troops as they moved across the open fields. It's very flat there, and I guess that's why there's a racetrack there in some areas. The 10th Armored Division had come through the night before and attacked the town next beyond Hockenheim. And they went across these open fields, and they took a terrible beating. They lost a lot of tanks. The Germans had set up a strong battery of 88s on the opposite side of the fields, which were maybe 500 yards across to the next town. And they destroyed the spearhead of the 10th Armored Division. And we came up in the morning, and we came down the road. It was just about daylight, and we saw a bunch of soldiers strung out on each side of us. And what we didn't know is that was the MLR. That was the main line of MLD, the main line of departure. They were all riflemen, and they were getting ready to move forward because when the armor got knocked out, they called for foot infantry to go up and take the town. And they were going to shell it, and they were going to go on into it and take the town. And we got up there and somehow or other missed signals. And so we drove our truck down this road, and the first thing we came to, beyond the MLD, was a burning tank. We went around the tank, and I looked up and I saw this hole in the turret of the tank through both sides. Flat holes, and I said, gee, that thing's been hit by 88 fire. And it's still on fire. So we went around that tank and down the road where we thought we were supposed to go. And we're going down this road, and there's nobody around us now. Nobody. We're all alone. And on one side there's a Sherman tank that's been knocked out, and its treads are spread out. And I looked over there, and I could see that there was a body in the turret of the tank, and it was probably the tank commander, and it had been knocked out. And I have a picture of that I took with my little Kodak 620. And we kept going, and there were no other tanks there that we could see. There were a few more back behind us off to the side. And we went down the end of that was a roadblock. So we went down, around, off the road, around the roadblock, into town, nobody, not a sign of anybody. And I looked down the right, and there was a hedgerow down on the right. And behind the hedgerow was about 12 88s, all facing back down the road. That was what knocked out the 10th Armored Division spearhead, was this whole battery of 88s. No German soldiers. So we went into town and stopped, and I banged on some doors and got some civilians. And when they came up, I said, wo sind die deutsche Soldaten? And they said, weg, 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 weg. Schnell, yes, gestern Abend, and so forth. So I said, they're gone. They left last night. So they said, well, let's go see if we can meet up with the other guys. They must have come through here already. And so the other Germans began to come out, and they saw these Americans, and they were all looking wide-eyed and frightened. And so we just got men, kept going. We went through two more towns, and each town they told us the same thing, that the Deutsche soldiers had gone the night before. And so here we'd gone through 3 towns by ourselves, a little anti-tank gun crew, and we're in the 3rd town now. And again, a few civilians telling us the same thing, and we hear tanks coming from the German side. Oh my God, one anti-tank gun, and this sounded like a whole column of German tanks coming, and we could see a little dust and stuff, and we could see the tanks coming, and there wasn't much we could do. What are we going to do? There's nothing to do. So we watched them for a bit, deciding whether it looks like we're going to be captured late in the war, and or worse. And we stood in, and all of a sudden we could see there were white stars on these tanks. And they're coming down this road, and they're buttoned up and for business. I mean, they were all, cannons are pointing right down the road at us and everything. So we went out in the roads, this way. And the first tank stops and looks, and the column stops. And then this tank starts rolling forward, and the hatch opens up. And this guy comes up, and he shouts at us, who are you? I said, we're 399th, 2nd Battalion. We were supposed to move up here. We heard that the 10th Armored Division had some problems, and they called for infantry. This guy climbs down out of the tank. He said, what the hell are you talking about? I said, we saw all your tanks back there. He said, you came down that road? Yes, sir. He said, what the hell do you mean you came down that road? He said, well, we saw a few 88s here and there, and all this stuff. We knew what the hell was going on. They had gone all the way around